Good morning, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the November 8th special meeting. We have two items to consider, but before we consider those, I'll declare the meeting open and ask you to be upstanding and ask Councillor Law for acknowledgement of Traditional Custodians.
On behalf of Council, I would like to start by acknowledging the Traditional Custodians of the Sunshine Coast local government area, the Kabi Kabi peoples of the coastal plains and northern hinterland, and on whose traditional lands we gather today, and the Jinnabara people of the southern hinterland. We wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role of First Nations people continue to play within the Sunshine Coast community. We commit to working in partnership with the Traditional Custodians and the broader First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and to support self-determination through economic and community development. And we know that together we are the guardians of this time for all the future generations.
Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you, Councillor Law. Councillors, will item 2 is a record of attendance, and we'll note the Mayor's an apology, and I'm informed that Councillor Dixon is a few minutes late but is on his way. Councillors, item 3 is informing of conflicts of interest, so I'd like to draw your attention that on the 12th of October 2020, amendments to the Local Government Act 2009 and Local Government Regulation 2012 came into force. These amendments include the new Chapter 5B, which sets out new legislative requirements for dealing with Council's conflicts of interest in local government matters. These arrangements will apply to how we manage such matters at this meeting. So item 3.1 is prescribed conflicts of interest, or 3.2 declarable. Do we have any? No, there are no declared conflicts of interest. So councillors, Councillor Natoli.
Just a question, Mr Deputy Mayor, in regards to our membership of the LGIA superannuation. Do councillors have a conflict, a declarable conflict of interest in that regard?
No, is the short answer. I think that's been covered in the past, and certainly it wouldn't have changed. But thank you for your question. So, councillors, we're now on to item 4.1, the Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan, proposed planning scheme regime, and we have a presentation from Deborah Robinson. Welcome, Deborah. Welcome, Councillor Dixon.
Good morning, Deputy Mayor, councillors. This morning's report is in relation to the Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan and the proposed planning regime. Okay. So the purpose of this report is to seek the support of Council for an application to Economic Development Queensland for Sunshine Coast Airport site to be declared a priority development area under section 37(1) of the Economic Development Act 2012. By way of context, Sunshine Coast Airport is a key contributor to the regional economy, being one of the region's most significant assets. It's a platform for diverse aviation and aerospace industry, hub of national significance. It is a new and direct international business, food export and tourism gateway within the region, facilitating connectivity with international export markets and greater visitation. The completion of the new $334 million expansion project, that's the runway expansion project, is designed to drive a $4.1 billion contribution to the region's economy through to 2041. If the full potential of the Sunshine Coast Airport as an asset can be realised. In terms of the commercial relationship with Council, this is quite important in respect of the planning around the airport. On the 9th of February 2017, Council entered into a long-term commercial agreement with Palisade Investment Partners Limited in respect of the operation and management of the Sunshine Coast Airport. That long-term commercial agreement is for 99 years at that point in time, so we're a few years into that agreement already. From 1 December 2017, on the commencement of the freehold lease, Council ceased to have responsibility for the control of the Sunshine Coast Airport site. Operations, tenancies, and operating business at the airport. It should be noted, councillors, however, that for the purposes of undertaking the Sunshine Coast Airport expansion project, that was enabled through a sublease between Sunshine Coast Airport Proprietary Limited and Council. Importantly, Council retains ownership of the airport land under that agreement and receives an annual lease payment of 5% of gross revenue generated from the Sunshine Coast Airport operations. This was identified by QTC, Queensland Treasury Corp, at the time as an exceptionally good outcome for Council and unprecedented. Council therefore has an ongoing interest in ensuring the airport is operated and developed in accordance with the airport objectives, which is set out under the agreement, for the benefit of Sunshine Coast, and ensuring that the Sunshine Coast Airport's revenue generating potential, and by extension, the annual lease payment to Council, is optimised. In 2019, in fulfilment of a requirement in the Sunshine Coast Airport Framework Agreement, the Sunshine Coast Airport Proprietary Limited prepared and delivered to Council a draft master plan. In terms of that master plan, on October the 17th, 2019, Council considered the Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan 2040 and acknowledged that it met the contractual requirements of the Framework Agreement. The Airport Master Plan does not constitute an approval under the current Sunshine Coast planning scheme. The airport must still obtain all necessary statutory approvals, including planning and development approvals. Unlike the master plans applying to airports operating under the Airports Act 1996, the Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan has no statutory effect, and development of the Sunshine Coast Airport is regulated through the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme 2014 under the Planning Act 2016. Of the top 15 ranked airports in Australia, the Sunshine Coast Airport is the only one where development is regulated under a local government planning scheme. And the list of those airports is appended to the report. I'd like to take you to impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on airport operations. As I've already mentioned, the airport is a key contributor to the regional economy, but the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the tourism industry and airport operations has emphasised even more than ever the importance of the Sunshine Coast Airport being able to pursue additional and alternative revenue streams consistent with its master plan and aligned with Palisade Investment Partners' investment plans. The pandemic has seen a significant impact on airport operations, including a significant drop in passenger numbers, both inbound and outbound, noting that 95% of passengers come from interstate markets. There's been also a reduction in retail and food beverage at the airport, and a corresponding reduction in revenue from ancillary facilities operating at the airport, such as car rental and car parking fees for both long-term and short-term stays. Developing a diversity of income streams and providing confidence for investment is of critical importance to sustaining the airport's future. The airport has requested Council to advise a preferred planning approach for the Sunshine Coast Airport site moving forward, in order for investment at the Sunshine Coast Airport to be advanced with greater certainty, so that the objectives of the Regional Economic Development Strategy, the REDS, and the Airport Master Plan can be realised. The challenge, councillors. Sunshine Coast Airport has advised that Palisade Investment Partners has planned to invest in excess of $200 million in capital improvements to the Sunshine Coast Airport over the next 5 years, consistent with the intent of the master plan. This investment includes terminal redevelopment, the development of a gateway precinct at the entrance to the Sunshine Coast Airport site, and the expansion of the aerospace precinct, the home of general aviation and aerospace business on the Sunshine Coast. For the Sunshine Coast Airport to achieve the outcomes that have always been envisaged for that asset, and with a reasonable level of certainty associated with the scale of the intended investment proposed by Palisade, an appropriate land use planning regime needs to apply to the site. Land use planning at Sunshine Coast Airport is currently via the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme. The Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme was put in place prior to the current model of ownership for the airport being determined. That is, prior to the commercial agreement with Palisade Investment Partners being entered into by Council. The current planning regime through the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme is a significant impediment to future Sunshine Coast Airport development, will be difficult and time-consuming to modify and respond to the needs of a contemporary airport. The current planning regime through the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme is not responsive and does not afford the sufficient certainty for necessary investment in the site to be realised in a timely manner. And it exposes Council and the region's ratepayers to cost and time impacts of submitter appeals. And I might add to that, not just submitter appeals, but applicant appeals. Both could potentially occur. In addition to the inadequacies of both the current planning regime and other options available under the Planning Act 2016, the majority of which would see Council retain authority for planning and development assessment decisions in relation to the Sunshine Coast Airport site, a matter of particular concern is there exists a real conflict of interest for Council. Council has a number of distinct roles in relation to the Sunshine Coast Airport site, being as a statutory local government established under the Local Government Act 2009, with statutory responsibility for the good rule and governance of the local government area. Number two, as a statutory assessment manager under the Planning Act 2016 for any development application or indeed any planning scheme amendment. Number three, as owner of the Sunshine Coast Airport land. And number four, Council's commercial interest in maximising or optimising the operations of the Sunshine Coast Airport. This stems from the commercial lease arrangement under which Council receives a payment annually from Sunshine Coast Airport of 5% of gross revenue from airport operations. So therefore, Council has a clear commercial interest in supporting optimisation of the revenue generated from airport operations. legal advice obtained suggests that Council could implement alternative governance and probity arrangements which could address any potential conflict between its position as owner of the Sunshine Coast Airport and its role as the assessment manager for the development of the Sunshine Coast Airport land under the Planning Act 2016. However, such arrangements would not entirely resolve the ongoing conflict that exists between Council's interest in optimising the commercial performance of the Sunshine Coast Airport and in discharging its planning and development assessment responsibilities. A proposed way forward. To address the conflict that exists for Council and to provide greater certainty for the Sunshine Coast Airport, it is proposed that Council support an application by Sunshine Coast Airport to the Deputy Premier for the declaration of the Sunshine Coast Airport site as a priority development area under Section 37(1) of the Economic Development Act 2012. A priority development area would afford clearer separation between the respective roles and interests of Council in relation to the Sunshine Coast Airport site. The Economic Development Act was established specifically to facilitate economic development and development for community purposes in Queensland. The Economic Development Act provides a mechanism that would afford clearer separation between the respective roles and interests of Council through the declaration of the site as a priority development area. The planning and development assessment approval authorities would reside with Economic Development Queensland, not with Council. The potential declaration of the Sunshine Coast Airport site as a priority development area is not inconsistent with the approach that Council has taken since 2013 in regards to Maroochydore City Centre. This approach was similarly taken to avoid the potential conflict of interest that exists for Council in optimising the commercial performance of that development, which could conflict with the discharge of the planning and development assessment responsibilities. So how would a PDA declaration operate? The primary planning instrument that would apply to the Sunshine Coast Airport site, if declared a priority development area, would be the development scheme once it is approved. On declaration of a priority development area, an interim land use plan would be in place to facilitate initial developments until a development scheme is made, approximately 12 months. Although an interim land use plan, just like a temporary local planning instrument, a TLPI, could be in existence for up to 2 years. There are statutory requirements in place to ensure the draft development scheme is publicly notified, and the community has the opportunity to make submissions on the draft scheme, which must be considered before the scheme is finalised, in much the same way that occurs with making a planning scheme or a scheme amendment, but with another body being the final approval authority. The public submission period is a minimum of 30 business days for a proposed development scheme. However, Council could seek that this be for a longer period of time. If a PDA is declared for the Sunshine Coast Airport site, Council would continue to maintain its role as landowner of the site and would be an advice agency in the context of both the preparation and consideration of the development scheme and any amendment to the development scheme. And, importantly, in the context of any development applications made under an approved development scheme. As landowner, Council's consent for any application over the site must be obtained. Hence, this provides a sufficient and a key lever for Council in the context of any development proposal that may be considered to be incompatible with the airport objectives under the framework agreement or with the approved development scheme for the site. Councillors, in terms of the officer recommendation, it is recommended that Council A, receive and note the report titled Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan, Proposed Planning Regime. B, agree to support an application to Economic Development Queensland for the Sunshine Coast Airport site to be declared by regulation as a priority development area under the Section 37(1) of the Economic Development Act 2012. C, subject to B, authorise the Chief Executive Officer to inform the Deputy Premier and Minister for State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning, it's a long title, of Council's support and declaration of the Sunshine Coast Airport site as a priority development area. And D, note that Council as landowner must provide consent to any development application made over the site which provides a key lever for Council in the context of any development proposal that may be considered incompatible with airport objectives or indeed with the approved development scheme for the site. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Councillors, do I have someone to move? Councillor Hungerford? Do I have a seconder? Councillor Apres, thank you. Would you like to open?
Through you, Mr Chair, Deputy Mayor. This is about governance. Good governance. Now, conflicts of interest, both for any organisation or individual, do happen. But it's how we deal with them that defines us. Now, we have several major achievements, and because of our good governance, they've all been outstanding successes. The solar farm, the city centre, the airport, and the subsea cable. Because of good, sound governance, they've all been outstanding successes. And to prove this, is Queensland Treasury audits us every year. This council has received 13 unmodified audits in a row. Not only that, our business units, including the city centre, have all received unmodified audits also. That's because of the sound management and good governance applied at all times. Now, we've received, and I have, and I'm sure all councillors have, quite a few residents, quite a lot actually, that have concerns with this and fears. Now, I remember I was also the same when we did the same with the city centre. I had fears that we wouldn't have control and we'd lose our ability to represent our community. But I've seen that hasn't eventuated. In fact, we have substantial control. And look at the success of the city centre today. So what we're looking at here is similar to the city centre, with Sun Central and a PDA. It removes our direct conflict. It removes that allegation of bias that council's feathering its own nest or making decisions that benefit us, not the community, which is incorrect. Now, what has been stated also here is any planning scheme for the airport will be publicly advertised and consulted with the community. Council will have the say as to what that plan entails. We'll have significant input. And the community is who we represent. Now, if you actually look in the agenda for the meeting, if a PDA is declared, the SCA site, Council would continue to maintain its role as landholder of the site and would be an advice agency in the context of both the preparation and consideration of a development scheme. We own the land. We've got to give consent. We have control in that. We have significant input into what goes there and to take our community's concerns on board with any of those. Council does not devolve that responsibility to our community. And any amendment to the development scheme. So if there's any amendments applied for, again, we are the landholder. We have to give consent. We have substantial say in whatever's taken forward. Same as the city centre. And in context of any development applications made under the approved development scheme. We're the landholder. We have to give consent. We have substantial say through the whole process. We are not devolving it away from the community at all. We're in fact the community's advocate. In addition, as landholder, Council's consent for any allocation of the site must be obtained, hence this provides a significant and key lever for Council in the context of any development proposal that may be considered to be incompatible with the airport objectives and the approved development scheme for the site. So we're guardian of that all the way through, and we have that input and say. I had concerns with the city centre, but those concerns and fears I had have not eventuated. So they're unsubstantiated. So I'm quite comfortable now that this is the proper governance mechanism for Council to deal with this into the future. And we are not turning our back on the community at all. I certainly would not do that. I would not be moving this today if I thought that was what we were doing. We are here for the community. I'll leave it at that. So now my 5 minutes is up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Councillor Prey, did you wish to speak?
All questions at the moment, if I can, Mr. Chair. And these questions are related to the, at last count, the 41 emails, 9 were copy and paste, 12 were another email copy and paste, 7 text messages I received, and 1 Facebook message. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing out all of these concerns of the community to lay on the table here today. I guess the very first one that has been in the majority of the emails that have been sent to me, Ms Robinson, is in relation to the residents of the area in and around the airport are concerned, and rightly so, about greater traffic movements. And I talk about greater traffic movements not so much in the sense of cars and traffic going to the airport, but more so in the future years of freight, of food and ag business taking off on the airport side in the way of some sort of distribution centre. Truck movements particularly is the concern of the residents. So the truck movements that are going to go in and out of the airport, understanding that there is a direct new inland's probably not the right word, in-property route that's going to be driven, a road that's going to go through. Can you give me some sort of an indication on if and when the truck movements will impact the community there for, let's say, the example of fruit and veg freight to go in and out of the airport and the impacts on David Low Way and the residents there? Thank you. That's my first question of a few.
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Councillor, for the question. The numbers of traffic movements and freight and truck movements in terms of logistics or warehousing or any other things that might be compatible with an airport would be required to go through a full detailed traffic analysis and assessment at the time of any application over the airport. So we don't know that level of detail at this point in time, but what I can assure you is just like if it was under our council's planning scheme, any application for any uses on the airport would have to be satisfied in terms of additional expert reports around traffic movements, haulage routes, and so forth. It would be exactly the same as if it was under the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme versus a priority development area. The Economic Development Queensland, and James is over this, would need to take into consideration all impacts, just like our team in council would have to take account of all impacts in relation to airport and traffic and truck movements and haulage routes.
Subsequent question?
Yeah, I've got a number if I... It might take a little time, this is in my division. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Keep going.
Another theme that's running through a lot of the community considerations is that council are going to lose control. We're handballing it onto the state. We don't have a say anymore. The state will overshot us anyway. This is a lot of commentary that's coming to me and to others. You made the comment there that as the landowner, council have to give consent. Can you explain that a little bit for me and for the people that may be watching today? So is it like this? Is it like if I own a house in the back of Maroochydore and I'm renting it out, can my tenants make an application to council for an MCU? Is that the sort of thing that we're facing here, which is absurdity because it has to be done through the property owner, correct? All right. So is that the same principles here? So as we are the landowner and we've got a tenant in Palisade and Sunshine Coast Airport that want to make an application for an MCU, for rezonings, whatever it might be, that has to be done through the property owner, right? Just like if I had the back street house in Maroochydore.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, any application over land owned by council, and this is the same as a priority development area in Maroochydore, must have landowner consent. An application is not properly made under either the Planning Act 2016 or the Economic Development Act 2012 without landowner consent being given. So if the airport were to make an application that was against A, its approved development scheme, then council would have the ability to not provide owner's consent, and that application would be unable to be lodged because it would not be considered to be properly made. The second part of that question, if I could, through you, Deputy Mayor, is if a PDA is declared and an application lodged and council provides its consent to that application, council is also an advice agency. So let me take you through what happens now with Maroochydore, and I'll give you an example which is currently on foot. The multi-deck car park is lodged with Economic Development Queensland with council's consent for that lodgement. That couldn't have been lodged without our consent. Well, it could have been. It wouldn't have been properly made, and it would have sat there until consent was given by the landowner. That application will come back into council, not into my team, but into James's team for a review against the development scheme provisions and the provisions within the precinct that that multi-deck sits in for advice agency response. So it actually comes back in twice. First for landowner consent, and secondly, independently. So say if I was to give landowner consent, which I did on the lodgement of the application for the multi-deck at Maroochydore, so that's a live application as we're talking now, that comes back in through James's team with no consultation with me whatsoever, and it is assessed against the planning scheme and the development scheme provisions to ensure that it aligns with those. That is an independent assessment, advice agency, advice, and it is written back to EDQ. We write back to EDQ in that advice agency, and we say whether we support or we do not support, or we support with changes.
That's really comforting to hear that. Thank you for that response.
Can we?
Am I on?
No, you might. I was just
My
waiting for your
apologies.
mic to go on.
It really beautifully leads me into my next question about the submission process. So if I'm a community member that's living out near the airport and I'm not happy that something's going to happen in the airport, whether it be, pick anything, a big box retail's potentially going to go on site there. My submission process is critical. My voice needs to be heard. Now that I've got to go through the state, can you explain to me what the community's submission process is? Do I still write to the council? Do I write to the state? Do I write to both? Do I write to the Division 8 councillor? How does that work?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. So the community gets a chance to publicly, the development scheme is publicly notified. So the community get a chance on the development scheme to actually lodge submissions against that development scheme holistically. In the event that that development scheme is approved, third-party submitters and appeal rights do not go along with that development scheme. So therefore, on each individual application, the community do not have the right to lodge a submission, as in they can lodge a submission, but it won't be considered. Let me just say this though, that if it stays within the Sunshine Coast planning scheme, putting aside conflicts and having to deal with it separately, if the applications stayed with the council within the Sunshine Coast planning scheme remit, it could well be that a number of the uses, because they would be airport operations and related to airport type uses, would be considered to be compatible uses that might be A, self-assessable, i.e. no application required, or B, code accessible, in which case the community doesn't have a right to lodge submissions or have third-party appeal rights either. So either way, the same process could apply under our current planning scheme. It is only impact accessible applications where there are third-party appeal rights.
Last one, if I may, please, Mr. Chair. And this is probably the most significant one of the way I'm sort of leaning today, and that's the conflict of interest regarding potentially a landowner is in council with a 5% royalty each year on year for the next 100 years or 99 years now. How is it even possible that it's not under the Act that we don't have a significant enough conflict of interest with the profitability, with the decision-making processes that we're going through, when in our day-to-day meetings, I'm stepping out of the meetings every month for one thing or another, because I'm a friend of a friend, I have to step out of a meeting, and here we are looking at potentially millions of dollars of profitability to the Sunshine Coast Council and communities because of our royalties, and yet we can still somehow have the ability to make those decisions on the land use. I'm really, really conflicted there. I know that's it's a point of the point D in your recommendation. Can you just explain that to us? How is it possible that we're even making this decision today? Why isn't it under the Act that it should automatically go through to the state? And just as another side note to that, you did mention that there was a top 15, I think you said, airports in Australia, and we're the only one that is, because of that conflict of interest, I'm assuming, that it's managed by the state in the decision-making process rather than the local government.
Through you, Deputy Mayor. I might take the last question first, and then I'll go back to the first question last. So, in terms of I'll start with the first question, sorry. In terms of the decision-making, and in terms of the conflict of interest, if council were to get a straight, let's pull a figure, $100,000 a year, and it didn't matter what happened on the airport land, council was entitled to a straight $100,000 a year, then council would have limited conflict of interest because it's not a party to actually maximising or optimising the outcome. So with council being the planning assessment authority, effectively council is judge, jury and executioner with respect to the planning regime that exists here over the airport. So the conflict of interest matter exists for council because it is landowner, just like it exists at Maroochydore. So let me take an example. Let's say that the airport came in and said, we've got an Olympics coming. Let's say the airport came in and said to us, we'd like to build a 5-storey hotel. And from council's perspective, we say, actually, we'd like you to do an 8-storey hotel. Council has a benefit then of achieving more gross revenue as a result of, from a planning scheme or from a assessment authority perspective, pushing them up. We negotiate all the time with our planning applications. Not necessarily up, sometimes down. But regardless, there is a potential conflict of interest with council having the planning hat on over here, the landowner hat on over here, and guess what? We're also in to get 5% of GR for any uplift. The uplift is in the land value. We own the land. So therefore, we do have a conflict of interest. So hopefully I've answered that question. In terms of your second question, which related to why isn't it it's sitting in our planning scheme. I suppose what we did with Maroochydore, obviously, was it was already a PDA. And council started to obviously undertake the works there. And then we entered into a commercial arrangement. In regards to the airport, we've entered into a commercial arrangement while it's still sitting embedded in our planning scheme in terms of plan making and plan assessment responsibilities. So hopefully that answers your question.
Just like a little bit more detail on how we're in this position today to make this decision that we need to make it a PDA, whereas I would think that if it's such a strong conflict of interest, I would only assume that it would go to the state no matter what, because of the dollar values that are in consideration. So why isn't it under the Act that we should automatically go to a PDA?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, this is why this report is put forward today. I can't talk about the past. I wasn't involved in the commercial negotiations at that time. But what I can say is that when this came across to my area of council to look at, the conflict of interest was immediately clear to me, which is why this report is before you today.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Mr. Chair. I know I've taken a lot of time. Thank you.
Councillor Dixon.
Good morning, and I apologise for being a few minutes late today.
Not at all.
I'll ask these questions to the Chair, and they might be answered by the CEO, Greg Laverty, or others in the room. Could someone please answer when this report was actually released publicly? Do we have a date?
Yes.
Megan, are you able to answer that?
Same day as the old agenda.
Friday?
Friday, yeah.
Yep.
So last Friday.
So Friday? Do we know what the nature of urgency was for releasing that report on Friday? I know the meeting's today on a Monday. Obviously, the community weren't afforded a lot of time to go through the report. What's the urgency for the meeting today?
Actually, sorry,
So correction.
Yeah.
Councillor
Can
CEO.
I answer that through you, Deputy Mayor? So you just heard the clarification. It was released last Monday, not last Friday. Part of the concept for this special meeting was that it was originally intended to go with the ordinary meeting. So we had a very full ordinary meeting agenda, and we elected to take two matters off there to be a special part of the special meeting today. So it was really only to spread the load over a couple of days rather than any other particular interest.
Okay. In regards to the Priority Development Area, or PDA, who has the ultimate veto power? Is it council? Do we make the final decision, or is that for the state government? Who has the ultimate decision-making power?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I might just ask my expert in PDAs to respond to that question. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for the question, and through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. The ultimate decision rests with the Minister. So the Minister for Economic Development Queensland, who is also the Minister for Planning and the Deputy Premier at the present time, is the ultimate decision maker in relation to the declaration of a priority development area. Having said that the Act makes specific provision for the local government's view to be taken into account by the Minister in arriving at decision. So hence, if this application or this proposal for a declaration was to proceed, it would be a proposal made by Sunshine Coast Airport, but with the support, pending your decision today, from the Council to give the Minister the comfort that the Council is supportive of his consideration of a declaration of a priority development area.
Appreciate that, thank you. So I understand from the presentation today that the lease was signed on the 1st of December 2017. Did we get any indication from Palisade Investment Partners that they wanted to progress with an immediate planning scheme amendment at the time? And if not, do we know why it's taken so long for, we're in 2021 now, for us to raise this as a matter of urgency? I'm just trying to understand the time lag between the lease being signed. Now it's urgent, we must proceed with the PDA. I'm just trying to understand why we haven't progressed the planning scheme amendment since 2017.
Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure I can respond to that. I've had carriage of the airport for approximately 5 months now, or thereabouts. Greg Laverty, my colleague, may be able to respond if that's okay through you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you.
Please do.
Through you, Mr. Chair, when in 2015-2016, when the expressions of interest and the market sounding were done in relation to the funding strategy for the airport, the feedback from all interested parties, particularly through the market sounding exercise, indicated that they would prefer the state government to look after the planning for the airport at that time. So that's the first bit of feedback in relation to when these matters were first raised by Palisade or other interested parties. The other point that I'll make is that in 2016 versus 2021, the conflict of interest provisions are significantly different. So the Belcara review has happened in the meantime. So the conflicts of interest today are very different, they're treated very differently or handled very differently to what they were in 2016.
Could I just ask, before Mr. Laverty goes, because I'm assuming he's got a fair bit of knowledge in this space, do you know if any promises were made to Palisade Investment Partners around the lease that if they do sign the 99-year lease, they would get a PDA? And further to that, do we know if they've raised any concerns around the community being able to have a conversation or submit against changes at the airport? Have they raised any risk around that in terms of their commercial operation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in relation to the first one, no commitments or guarantees were given to Palisade or anyone else around the planning arrangements when the funding strategy was put into place in 2016. I'm not sure about the second question in relation to whether they've raised questions more recently around the impacts on their commercial operations.
Does anyone know if Palisade have raised any concerns or risks around the community having a buy-in to the airport development at all? And obviously, in that regards, their push for or likelihood to see a PDA eventuate? Is that something that's been conversed upon?
Let's see whether Ms Robinson can address that.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, the airport have certainly had discussions with me around the urgency and the certainty and the diversity needed for airport operations. This is unprecedented times. COVID-19 has undoubtedly the airport's been significantly impacted, as many businesses throughout the Sunshine Coast have been with the COVID-19 impacts. They're proposing $200 million worth of investment in the airport, and that is available for this council and this community to take advantage of. Money is portable. It's highly likely that if they don't have the certainty and diversification out of the airport, in terms of airport uses that you would expect to see at an international airport, then they will take their money elsewhere. This is a significant economic asset operating under a commercial agreement. It's not only recognised by Council's Regional Economic Development Strategy as that asset, but it's also recognised under the South East Queensland Regional Plan as being a significant asset for this region. We have an Olympics and a Paralympics happening on the Sunshine Coast in 11 years, and excuse the pun, but the runway to that is fast being chewed up in time. We need a fully functioning, successfully operating international gateway to provide direct access to the region and for our residents and ratepayers. Costly time is costly, appeals are costly, and money is portable. So I'll just probably leave you with that response, Councillor Dixon.
Just last question if I can. On page 21 of the report, it talks about the 15 ranked airports. How many of those airports on that comparative list are owned by a local council?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that none of them are governed by a local government planning scheme.
Okay, appreciate that. I might just quickly speak, and I was going to wait to the end, but I won't do that. Fully supported the airport, have always supported the airport. Been to the community meetings. I understand that there's a lot of angst, and there continues to be a lot of angst around it. It's an international airport now, and people have raised a number of concerns, particularly in the last week. I've seen a lot of those emails come through, and I've seen submissions from Oscar and other community groups within the region. For me, I understand that there's some conflict in people's minds about how we progress with an airport development, considering that there's a conflict for council because we derive revenue that may be accelerated through land use intensification. And I understand that. Recent example, Brisbane Road car park. So we owned it, community land. We built a car park and we sold off the other half to build a hotel. That's what's being built on it. And then we separated that conflict by having an external consultant run the planning applications. And I saw that as a benefit because there was clearly a conflict. And as Councillor Hungerford outlines, there's a conflict as well. But I still feel that we can get around that. I still think if there's a rule, there's a way to get around the conflict matters, particularly at the airport. Now, I got into this job because people wanted me to have a responsibility. They elected me to make the planning decisions, good and bad. And I've made some bad planning decisions. I've also made some good ones. And I'll state that for the record. But it's clear that people aren't particularly upset that things are happening at the airport. I think if you ask Division 6 residents, there's no fallout. They're in full support of the airport as they have been for years. But what the residents are asking me and the content that I've received is that I represent them in the decision making around the airport. They're saying, you own it. This is very unique. You might have a lease over it, but council still owns the airport and we want you to make the planning decisions. Recent example around light rail, I took a stand because I didn't support an option and I felt kicking the can down the road to let another government agency make a decision didn't sit well with me. Again, I need to apply that principle to this decision because for me, this is what I'm elected to do. I'm not elected to pass decisions off to the state government. I'm really not. And as far as I'm concerned, if council had more buy-in with areas like Aura and Calandra South, we might actually get some better outcomes. But it's quite easy to blame the state government because they're the decision maker. I don't want to sit here and have to blame the state government around a poor decision for the airport when the residents are asking us to be accountable in that space. So I'm not just going to sit here and vote against it. I want to outline what I'm concerned about. And for me, there's been plenty of time for council and Palisades to actually get planning scheme amendments up. You know, we've had many years to work on this, and for this now to be an issue and we have to expedite it so quickly shows that yes, there's urgency, but I think we can take another route on this. And for that reason and for the reasons outlined today, I just can't support the officer's recommendation. I'm really, really sorry. I try not to make a point of it. I've been very pro-council over the years, but in this case, I think the community are asking for us to be the custodians of the planning scheme, not the state government.
Thank you, Councillor Dixon. Councillor Suarez.
Thank you. Through the Chair. Great questions, Councillor O'Prey and Councillor Dixon. Mine sort of follow along a bit of the same route, and it's basically understanding the history of the site and the decisions that were made around the planning regime that going forward. So Mr Laverde mentioned that the matters were raised in 2016 and the Sunshine Coast Airport Framework Agreement was settled in February 2017. And under that agreement, currently, as was agreed by all parties, it would be considered under the Sunshine Coast Planning Scheme, 2014. So when we made that agreement, that framework agreement, did we consider the conflicts of interest back then? And I know Mr Laverde said that there were changes with Belcara, but surely there were conflicts back in 2017 as well. Did we consider the conflicts of interest back in 2017 and how we would manage them under the Sunshine Coast Airport Framework Agreement?
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, I can't answer that question. Paul Skillen is around, so I might just, hopefully he's watching the screen, him and respond to that question. Thank you.
Welcome, Mr Skillen.
Through the Chair, sorry for my fleeting arrival. I did hear the question. The answer is yes, it was contemplated throughout the construction of the agreement and coming to our final conclusion on what it was. I think it should be noted that the agreement didn't hamper changing to anything else. So the concept was council has owned land that it has owned as the landowner and also dealt with the planning matters of itself before, and that will continue to happen after this occurs. There are some instances, Deborah's spoken to some before, such as MCC, where decisions were made at particular points of time in order to understand what the best way to deliver it was, and the agreement as it currently stands hasn't hampered any other way. I would further add to that, though, that the agreement placed the development of the new master plan with Scapel and Palisade to be created in I think it was about 18 months after the agreement was to take effect. They were best positioned to know after taking control of the airport what they were going to develop and how and when they were going to develop. Council wouldn't have been in that position anymore. So the timing was always that the the planning scheme would be developed. That's the one that now exists, the 2020-2040 one, and the way forward could be assessed from there. Currently, the way forward, without any changes today, would be that they would make planning applications as many occupiers of council-owned land do from time to time.
Thank you. When we talk about conflicts of interest have significantly changed since the time of that framework agreement as a result of Belcara, I'm not sure what those significant changes are. Are you able to speak to what the changes have been since the framework agreement to current day?
Through the Chair, I'll have to defer on that.
Thank you.
I think this is to Lavati.
Yeah.
Through Mr Chair, that was just a general statement. For example, if those councils who were here in 2016 when you declared a conflict of interest at a council meeting, it's very different to the processes now. So it's just a general statement that conflicts of interest have changed. No direct or specific part of the framework agreement that I can point to, just a general change in the landscape in relation to conflict of interest management.
Answer your question?
Not quite. So the conflict of interest that have changed since the Belcara, that's relating to councillors' personal conflict of interest. So did anything change in terms of the process for the planning regime since 2016, 2017 to current day? Because we're the landowner, etc.
So there's probably someone better off answering that question in relation to the planning scheme than myself.
Okay. I'll leave that question on notice. I have another question, which was some of these have been asked by other councillors. So Sunshine Coast Airport, or Palisade I should say, raised the matter in 2016 that their preference would be for the state to manage future developments. But since we signed that agreement and Sunshine Coast Airport Proprietary Limited had been formed, was there any time since then that Sunshine Coast Airport raised this matter again, that their preferred method would be to go to a PDA?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, Sunshine Coast Airport have raised with me directly that their preferred method is to go to a priority development area.
So only fairly recently?
Certainly in the last 5 months. I couldn't put an exact date on it, Councillor Suarez.
Okay, I'm just trying to get the options and the timing together, because in 2019, I think it was, we put together a proposed planning scheme amendment, and that's one of the options that has been looked at here, and one of the detractors for that option is the time that would be taken to put in a proposed planning scheme amendment. Why wasn't the Sunshine Coast Airport a site that was considered in our proposed planning scheme amendment to assist with progressing future planning assessments going forward?
You able to answer that question?
No, Deputy Mayor, I'm not in charge of the planning scheme. James, did you have an answer to that question? I know you were talking. It's a question around the Sunshine Coast planning scheme. And
Sorry, I'm sorry, I was in conversation. What was the specific question again?
So we were of the understanding in 2016, 2017 that Sunshine Coast, or Palisade or Sunshine Coast Airport, their preferred method for a planning regime would have been through the state government or via a PDA. One of the other options alternative options to our current agreement, in the framework agreement, is to change the planning scheme to suit the purposes of the airport going forward. So why wasn't the Sunshine Coast Airport land considered in the proposed planning scheme amendments that we've just recently undertaken? Because if it had of, we would be considering that matter on Wednesday.
Yes, and I can understand the question through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. I think one of the key issues has been that the master plan prepared by the airport, and this is set down in the report for yourselves, contains uses at a very high level, or it describes precincts at a very high level. It's not specific enough to provide the basis for a planning scheme amendment. And that master plan was prepared really not all that long ago, and of course bearing in mind that pretty much for the entire time since its existence we've been experiencing the effects of COVID-19. And so while I couldn't say for sure whether that's been one of the things that has prevented a more detailed consideration of what uses would be suitable on the airport and therefore make up the content of a proposed planning scheme amendment, but for whatever reason it's not progressed to the point where council is in possession of something that gives you enough substance on which to base a planning scheme amendment. I might go to the point also that around development assessment functions, our capacity to have an independent assessor deal with an application is quite clear. And as has been mentioned before, in the case of the Malula Bar car park, that was a method utilised. It's quite a different matter when it comes to the preparation of anything resembling a change to a planning scheme. So to use the Malula Bar car park as a specific example, if council had decided to put in a planning scheme amendment to benefit itself as the owner of that site to increase its development rights over and above anything else in the Wilbur, that would be a very distinct conflict of interest. And it's a role as a planning authority and council's ability to establish a basis on which it itself will benefit from the increased yield that might come under such a proposal is where we confront arguably our greatest conflict. And it's a conflict we cannot escape. Under the Planning Act, we make those decisions. We decide to seek the Minister's approval to notify, we assess submissions, we review those submissions, we present the scheme in whatever form it might be back to the Minister. The Minister ultimately decides to give us permission to adopt, but we adopt. So under each of those steps, there's no way we cannot defer that or deflect that responsibility to anybody else. The Act gives us no ability to do so. It's a situation where our role as plan maker is arguably the area where we are most conflicted around what it might mean for our ability to benefit council. And that, in benefiting council, you're benefiting all ratepayers, but nonetheless, it's a process that we can't escape that conflict.
Okay, thank you. I actually looked up the reference for the top 15 airports across Australia just to see if there were any other examples of council-owned airports that were leased out and are undergoing development. And I'm not 100% certain on this information, but is Coffs Harbour Airport, which is also owned by Palisades, and I know we have representatives from Sunshine Coast Airport in the room, who may be able to answer the question, but I don't think they're allowed to participate. Is the development at Coffs Harbour Airport undertaken under a PDA, or is it undertaken under the local planning scheme?
So the planning provisions that apply in New South Wales are different, obviously, because planning provisions are a state government responsibility, not a Commonwealth one. I'm not entirely familiar with the scheme provisions that would apply down there, but obviously they've managed to find a method of, and James Rupray is here, who has worked in New South Wales, so probably knows the situation better than I, so I might defer to my namesake.
Before you do, James, I did cut and paste from the Coffs Harbour Airport. I'll just read out the 3 points which may assist your answer. So in late 2018, the Coffs Harbour Council undertook a review of the governance model suitable for the airport, and after reviewing all relevant options available to it, it was resolved, reference 2018-269, that Council 1 progresses the airport lease model for the Coffs Harbour Airport to the next stages in preparation of due diligence and undertake an expression of interest. 2, endorse the procurement of independent expert advisors to assist with advancing the airport lease process. And 3, note that a further report on the outcome of the expression of interest will be provided to Council for consideration. Now, I'm not sure if that applies to the planning, so if you could just clarify that for me.
So they are, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, those are provisions that relate to the leasing arrangements, not to the planning process that would have applied. So I can understand, and it's not dissimilar to what we've been doing in relation to the leasing arrangements for ourselves. But I don't see where and how they interface with the planning regime, but James might like to talk to that.
Thank you, Mr Rupray.
Thank you, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Councillor, as James has outlined, the planning regimes in New South Wales are significantly different. The planning provisions, particularly around airport and aviation precincts and infrastructure, are largely handled under what's called the state environmental planning policies, which are statutory instruments which are specifically referenced in what is the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act in New South Wales. So it is a slightly different regime, but in essence the ultimate legislative head of power sits with the state government.
Councillor Suarez,
Thank you.
further questions or you
yes,
wish to
some more
speak?
questions. Sorry. Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. So in October 2019, the draft Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan 2040 was prepared. And in the additional information, it was discovered that it's not assessed by Council's technical land use planning specialist because there was not enough detail to the precincts. In the actual document of the Sunshine Coast Master Plan 2040, there's an infographic outlining the draft master plan process, and it indicates that during the preliminary draft phase, which occurred from April 2018 to May 2019, technical briefings were undertaken with Sunshine Coast Council and state agencies. So was it during those were those technical briefings collaborative sessions, or were they presentations from the Sunshine Coast Airport? Did Council have any input into those discussions?
Are you able to answer that, Mr Robertson?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. My understanding is I wasn't part of those discussions, so I wasn't in the room while those discussions took place. My understanding is, however, and it's very clearly articulated throughout today, is that the Sunshine Coast Airport Master Plan 2040 was a framework agreement requirement. It's not a statutory document, so it has no statutory weight whatsoever. So even if technical comments were made, went no way towards an assessment, a technical assessment of that master plan. That master plan has had no technical assessment.
Okay, so what I'm trying to establish is, in those technical briefings, if any issues were raised by the council or the state agencies, were they addressed in the final draft master plan that was presented by SCA?
Again, I'll have to defer the question. I'm sorry, it's just because my history doesn't go back as far as others in the room. Thank you.
Mr Rupray.
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Councillor, there were a number of sessions that were held between both the airport and our strategic planning branch, as well as I'm sure other branches within council at the time. The master plan that was put forward was a contractual obligation and not necessarily a land use planning instrument, and so the actual proposal at that time was to satisfy the contractual arrangements, not for a proposal for a long-term planning instrument or one that would be carried forward in that form to inform an actual planning scheme amendment. The conversations that we had at the time were specifically around the current use as defined by the community facility zones and the aviation precinct in particular, and the aspirations of the master plan that was put forward under the contractual arrangements, which would indeed require a level of planning and land use changes to facilitate those potential uses. That conversation and those conversations effectively did not effectively culminate into a planning scheme amendment, but have given rise to the further analysis which is before you today, including the options for a priority development area, given some of the other conflict of interest provisions that have been noted.
Thank you. With the draft Sunshine Coast Master Plan 2040, I know the Sunshine Coast Airport undertook quite an extensive community consultation period. Was a summary of community feedback from the consultation provided to Council?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, there is a community consultation report, and I believe that was part of the report that went to Council as part of that, I can't say approval, but part of that framework agreement. My understanding was the community consultation report did go to Council. It was part of that report.
Is that available, publicly available for the community?
I'll have to defer that question. I believe it is. We could probably find that out before the end of this meeting. Thank you. But I believe it is available. I certainly located it over the weekend.
Okay, good. Thank you, Deborah. So just thinking about the conflict of interest, and should this item not proceed, if the officer's recommendation was not supported, what would the alternative governance and probity arrangements be to address any potential conflict of interest?
Deputy Mayor, I can answer that question. So if the recommendation today was not supported, then obviously it stays as part of the planning scheme. In terms of that, it would go through a planning scheme amendment, just like any other proposal would go through a planning scheme amendment. In terms of each individual planning application proposal on each particular site, they would go through a planning assessment process, through a development assessment process. That development assessment process, just like we've already referenced Brisbane Road Car Park, in order to avoid conflict of interest from any issues to do with council assessing that application, it would have to be assessed by a third party, which council would then obviously pay for. and depending upon, of course, if it was an impact assessable, code assessable application, then submitter appeals and applicant appeals would have to be defended by council.
Thank you. Just to get some further clarification, so there'd be two parts to it: a planning scheme amendment
yes.
plus the impact assessable or other development applications.
Yes, that's correct.
So you couldn't just operate under the existing planning scheme with just development applications, whether they be impact or code assessable.
They're not. Yeah, I know the answer to that. Just double checking I wasn't going to get it wrong. Through you, Deputy Mayor, a lot of there's no fine grain uses in our current Sunshine Coast planning scheme, and a number of those uses, which would be relevant airport related uses that you expect to see at an international airport, would be impact assessable and probably inconsistent uses. I haven't done a full planning scheme assessment check. One of James's team has had a look, and some of the uses you would expect to see at an airport would be impact assessable, which means they'd be subject to submitter appeals, submitter objections and third-party appeals, either by applicant or submitter.
Okay, going on to the PDA, the agenda addresses the advantages of a PDA, which primarily focuses on timeliness and addressing the potential conflict of interest. What are the disadvantages of going to a PDA other than discarding community involvement and increase in timing of approvals?
Disadvantages of a PDA. Through you, Deputy Mayor, thank you for the question, Councillor Suarez. Disadvantages of a priority development area. I'm thinking about Maroochydore, so I'm trying to think about an application, a context that we actually have right now, and I'm trying to think of the disadvantages. One of the disadvantages that we've found at Maroochydore, and we've had to make application, and Councillor Natoli is well aware of this, is some of the conditions that are issued by Economic Development Queensland sometimes aren't put in the right frame, so that if we have to then I'll give you an example. We had a recent example of a noise exhaust issue in Maroochydore. Our officers went out to undertake a compliance inspection of that noise issue, and the condition wasn't as detailed as it might have been. So one of the disadvantages may well be that the conditions issued by the state might not align to the way in which council issues its own conditions. Having said that, we've since had a meeting with Economic Development Queensland around those conditions, and they are assuring us that they are tightening those conditions up so that council can actually undertake its compliance duties and has the ability to do that. That's really probably, James, I'm looking at James and he's nodding. That for me is probably, if I think of a live situation now that we're dealing with, and Councillor Natoli's across this as well, that would be a situation that we've had with Maroochydore at the moment. But again, Economic Development Queensland been very happy to work with us, and even as recently as the last couple of weeks we've sent a letter and outlined some conditions we would like to see included within their approval package.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So if a PDA were to progress and the development scheme would undergo a 30 business day community consultation period, any submissions made by the community would be directed straight to EDQ?
That's correct.
And would we get a report on the feedback from the community?
Yeah. I might just answer this and I'll hand across to James, through you, Deputy Mayor, my apologies. With the Maroochydore, I'm sorry I keep referring to that, but that is a live PDA that council owns the land, so it's a very similar situation. With Maroochydore, council actually was delegated by the minister to actually undertake the assessment of the submissions and provide a submission report to the minister. So in fact, council undertook that component of that PDA. So council actually wrote the submission, reviewed the submissions and wrote the submission report to the minister. James, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. In one of the questions that was put to us last week and we answered, we set down the responsibilities the minister has to fulfil in considering a priority development area. And the Act actually makes the Minister responsible for this, even though obviously his department does much of this on his behalf. But obviously there's a preparation of a scheme, the public notification, consideration of all submissions, the amendment as necessary of the content of the scheme in light of those submissions received, and the preparation and publication of a report about the submissions received and the amendments made to the development scheme, and then arranging for the gazettal of the development scheme. So the Minister has to publish a copy of the submissions received and how they have been responded to in consideration of the final content of the development scheme.
Thank you for that answer. Before you go on, we might mention that your inquiry about the public submissions, they are available publicly.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you.
Can I check, do you have...
I have only a few more, Mr Deputy Mayor. 3 more questions.
Thank you.
So Councillor O'Prey asked this question and I just want to seek clarification. So if a PDA was in place and the development plan development scheme was adopted, then after that, subsequent to that, there's individual development applications. Now, should the community want to make comment or submission on that, that also goes to EDQ? Those comments from the community?
Yes. Through you, Deputy Mayor. Yes, they'd go to EDQ. I suppose the point I was trying to make before, maybe I didn't make it very well, my apologies, was that the submissions would go to EDQ, assuming that they had the right to lodge submissions, which under a development scheme they wouldn't.
They don't. No, but if they wanted to express their issues or concerns, they would go to EDQ.
That's correct, yes.
And would Council get any feedback on what those submissions or comments would be?
Normally? Not normal. No, not necessarily.
So the community would have to lobby EDQ, but then they would also lobby their local councillors, I suppose, in terms of giving that land approval.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes.
Okay. Just in terms of the process when EDQ's undertaking a PDA, how much consideration do they put on the social and environmental factors? I know you only listed a few bullet points there in the report and they're all very economic focused, but there are some environmental considerations on this site in particular. So how much do they focus on the environmental aspects of any development?
So as part of the process, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, part of the process of both preparing the development scheme and then administering the scheme through applications made is that EDQ does, like all planning authorities, consider the full gamut of what produces an environmentally sustainable development. So that's the ecological, social and economic aspects of all development. So while the Economic Development Act has them sit outside the planning framework, they don't sit outside the state government's general adherence to the principles of ecological sustainability.
And then just on that final comment about landowners' consent and having the power of veto. So the feedback that I've also been receiving is, a PDA will cut the community out from having any say or concern, and it's the surrounding communities of the airport, and Councillor O'Prey and I share a lot of communities that would be impacted. If the community were making comments to EDQ if a PDA was in place, comments to EDQ, and then they were lobbying their individual councillors about issues or concerns they have about a particular development application. What is the process in giving landowners consent? So it goes to James, or does it come to council for endorsement by the full council?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. So if we think about Maroochydore, again, sorry to refer back to that, but that is a live example. If you think about the consent that we've recently given, I've given for, under my delegation, for lodgement of an application with EDQ for the multi-deck car park, councillors are certainly aware that there was a multi-deck car park proposed. In terms of supporting that, it's certainly recognised in the development scheme. So in terms of that landowner consent, I provided that landowner consent. That is not provided by James or his team because they have a different responsibility in council. So my hat, for want of a better word, is the commercial side, and to make sure that it complies with the direction that council's wanting to go in a commercial sense. So James's role, from his perspective, is from a advice agency to check that it complies with the development scheme. Now, of course, I'm a town planner by profession, so if it was something completely outside of the development scheme that was being proposed, then I would be bringing that back before council and asking the direction.
So essentially, not every application will come to council for endorsement?
No, that's correct.
I may reserve my right to speak after a number of other councillors have asked questions.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions. Firstly, I know a few of mine have already been answered, but I'll start with this one, if that's okay. Councillors received a letter yesterday, which I only saw this morning. It was from the group Oscar, and they were sort of just raising concerns in relation to the airport master plan and when that community consultation took place back in 2019. I just thought, is it possible for you to highlight what the community feedback was at that time, what it entailed?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. The reason I was looking yesterday at the consultation was because I wanted to understand what those submissions were about in respect of the 406 submissions made to the Sunshine Coast Airport on the draft master plan 2040. So I might just go through the analysis that I undertook of those submissions. More than half, approximately 51%, were from Noosa Shire. 25% of those submissions related to flight paths and the closure of the former runway 1836, neither of which have anything to do now with the declaration of a PDA. Obviously, the new runway has been completed and 1836 has been decommissioned. 12.5% related to the imposition of a curfew. Again, nothing to do with the declaration of a PDA at this point in time. The PDA declaration relates to land use, not aircraft movements. And the other submissions, so 51, 25 and 12, if someone would like to do the maths, the other submissions related to traffic impacts on David Low Way were considered to be important issues. Apparently changes were made to the master plan, and again, I was not part of that, so I did not want to raise this, mention this before to answer Councillor O'Prea's questions, but what I read was changes were made to the master plan to reflect a stage approach to freight, location of freight distribution to the Gateway precinct, and to examine options for an internal road access to the northern precinct. So that was the composition of the 406 submissions made to the master plan.
Thank you for that. I find that very interesting that more than 50% came from Noosa residents. Second question that I had was just in relation to a suggestion last week that council could consider renegotiating the 5% annual leaseback payment with Palisade to remove that potential conflict of interest. Is that a reasonable solution given this revenue actually benefits all of our ratepayers? And I noted in your presentation it actually said that it's previously been identified by the Queensland Treasury Corporation as an exceptionally good outcome and unprecedented.
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Selling or giving back council's 5% of gross revenue may be possible. Although this would need to be the subject of a renegotiation, a commercial renegotiation of the existing commercial lease with Sunshine Coast Airport. That will not remove council's conflict of interest because council will still be the landowner. Council will still continue to have a conflict of interest because it owns the land. The land value would still be impacted by planning decisions made in relation to that land, even if council's direct revenue is delinked from gross profit. Council will therefore still have to manage that conflict between its role as landowner of the land and the rolling plan making process. The current commercial arrangement provides a direct return to the ratepayer every year, and council would need to consider the implications of forsaking this revenue stream if it were to contemplate renegotiating this aspect of the Sunshine Coast Airport Framework Agreement. Council would also need to consider, apart from increasing rates, because remembering councillors, we only have a few ways in which to get revenue There are only a few ways we can get revenue opportunities. And one of those, if you were to renege on the 5% or renegotiate on the 5%, then council would need to consider that apart from increasing rates, charges, it has few other revenue opportunities available to it. And in an environment of increasing costs of services and increasing demand for services by our community, whether it is a responsible course of action, discard one of the very few revenue options that we have available to us. I'll leave that to your imagination. And there are currently no plans at this stage to renegotiate this aspect of the framework agreement.
Mr. Anderson, I actually read that in the additional information, but I just thought it was important for you to just qualify that this morning. Councillors, I will speak to it now, Mr. Chair. It's really good to see the interrogation of this report that's here in front of us today, so I just want to commend everyone that's spoken so far and their questions that they've asked. It's been really good to observe. But for me, when I look at the report, attachment 2 lists those 5 options. I think that there really is probably the essential part of this report where anything bar the declaration of PDA still contains those risks in terms of timing, the certainty and the transparency of those conflicts of interest. So if there's anything that I can refer you back to, that there is probably the key that I take out of this particular report and this item here in front of us today. And it gives me sort of further assurance when I look at the officer recommendation that's on the screen and I look at D, and it still talks about council as a landowner must provide their consent to any development application made over this site. So I'll keep it nice and brief this morning, but I will be supporting this here in front of us today.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Councillor Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Division 5 has very little involvement in what goes on at the airport, apart from the odd tourist, and perhaps in the future, maybe some of our fruit and vegetables may be exported out through there or transferred out through there. I've got a number of questions which come in relation to the emails that I have received over the last week. And my first one is, whereabouts on the airport site is any freight depot likely to be located?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll just have to grab my master plan.
By all means. Can meeting management access a plan?
Map of this.
If you can assist them identify what page it's on. We don't have
warehousing. There's warehousing throughout. Bear with me one moment, please. So Airport North Precinct. I've got a copy of it. Yeah.
I think that you'll have to do the best you can. Yes. Holding it up, I'm afraid we don't have it.
Essentially the old strip.
Access to, yes, sorry, excuse me.
It's essentially the old strip.
Yep.
Yeah,
so,
one part of that strip.
Yep, adjacent to David Low Way.
Right, thank you. So vehicular access to that will be from where? Will it be from the David Low Way or from old technology, the North Shore connection, or both? Or?
Just trying to find that. I'm just waiting.
Come on, QBD.
The Gateway Precinct also has freight as well. Duties contained in that. This is what I mean. This is not the difficulty I'm having through you, Deputy Mayor. Is this is not a master plan for land use planning purposes.
Yep.
There is still a lot of work to be done on movements of vehicles, traffic, access ways, etc. As James rightly said before, if you look at some of the uses, and this is why I'm struggling a little bit, because scattered throughout some of the land use activities, it has very high level uses. So that would be part of what the further master planning would be about, or the precinct planning would be about, to get down to the finer grain detail around the precinct plans.
So I think your answer is that you're not able to give a definitive answer
Can't give a
to
definitive
that.
answer, that's right.
Councillor Winston, do you have a further question?
So essentially, in that case, any development that would be subject to this would be in the green, the blue, or the brown, orange. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Yep. Right. Thank you. In a number of the emails, there was statements about increased trucks through Coolum. I'm just sort of finding it a bit hard to understand how that can be the case. I'd like an opinion as to whether that's a factual observation or not.
Let's see whether there's anybody in a position to speculate on whether trucks through Coolum would increase or not.
I mean, they're talking about significant.
Yeah. It's a very hard question for anybody to answer.
Through you, sir. Yes, that is a difficult question to answer because it very largely depends on what direction the goods that are seeking to be transported might be coming from. As you've rightly observed, in the hinterland is where much of the produce will be coming from to be transported to this site to then be freighted directly out to overseas markets. So it would depend on in which location the hinterland they come from. Intuitively, the access to this site via the motorway and from that direction would be the most logical thing for a freight movement to take place. No freight operator, unless the produce was coming from the immediate vicinity of Coolum, would choose to go via Coolum to get to the airport. It would simply not be part of a sensible logistics operation if they were using secondary routes like that, when primary routes that are far more direct would be available.
Thank you, James. Just a question in relation to Economic Development Queensland. Who makes up the membership of that decision-making body? Are they bureaucrats or?
The decision-making, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, decision-making in Economic Development Queensland resides in only one person, and that is the Minister for Economic Development Queensland. He is advised by Economic Development Queensland, so Economic Development Queensland prepares all of the briefing material that is provided to the Minister, but the decision-making rests with the Minister alone.
Yep, thank you. I've got a series of questions, I'm sorry. Deborah earlier mentioned the comparison between the Maroochy City Centre and this development, or this area, as a priority development area. In some of the emails, there was comparisons made between the airport site and Aura. Would you like to explain why Aura is a totally different type of PDO?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I'll give it a go, and James can add anything I might miss if that's okay. So Aura is not owned by council, it's owned by Stockland. So council has no oversight in terms of landowner oversight or responsibility for Aura in that regard. So it doesn't get the opportunity to provide landowner consent for any application lodged. That is the prime difference.
Yes.
Are there any other differences, James, that I may well have missed?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, related to the fact that we're not a landowner but Stockland is, that all of the applications produced by Stockland happen under their auspices referred directly to Economic Development Queensland. So the sole role that we play there is the one that my team exercises, which is when applications are received, they are referred to my team for appraisal and determination of consistency with the development scheme. And I would say the largest component of that effort on our part is consistency with the infrastructure agreement. a tripartite infrastructure agreement between Economic Development Queensland, ourselves and Stockland. So ensuring that any application does not cut across our interests in terms of the infrastructure delivered there. So it's quite a different circumstance to the airport, and one really that's not comparable.
Right. Thank you. Next question relates to operational hours. What are the current operational hours of the airport, and are they likely to change over time without community consultation?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I am unaware of the operating hours of the airport because that was not part of the consideration of a priority development area, and any change to those operating hours would, I'd imagine, would need to go back out to community consultation. But again, that's not my area of... Yeah, it's CASA, it's Air Services
I think
Australia.
it's again, an incredibly difficult question to ask over the life of a 90-plus year lease. But was there another point to that question, Councillor Winston?
Oh, just some of the people who sent emails were talking about it being a 24-hour operating airport with heavy cargo planes coming and going all hours of the night, all this sort of thing, and I was just trying to drill down a little bit to find out whether that is likely to be the situation or not.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps you've got another question?
Yes. Well, I've got a question in relation to... I'm just wondering what the potential cost exposure will be for council, for the Sunshine Coast Council, if it retains the current planning and assessment responsibilities in relation to this matter.
Thank you. Deborah?
Question I can answer broadly. Councillor Johnson. Sunshine Coast, if council was to retain the planning functions, then as I've already mentioned, we would be required to have a third-party assessment. So there'd be a cost for a third-party planning consultant to undertake the assessment of any applications lodged by the airport. So it wouldn't be a one Brisbane Road car park type situation. It would be every application would go out to an external planning consultant. And then, of course, in the event where there are impact assessable applications, then there would be third-party appeal rights by submitters and potentially third-party appeal rights third-party appeal rights by the applicant also. So I'd imagine the cost would be quite exorbitant in terms of undertaking that process, because we would be going out for every single application over the next X number of years, however long this airport master plan takes to develop, for every single application would be by a third-party consultant, as well as council finding the money to provide expert advice and fight appeals with respect to whether that be applicant or submitter appeals. So it'd be a significant cost.
Thank you for that. You're reserving your right to speak?
I'll reserve that right, but I may not speak.
Thank you. Councillor Landsberg.
Thank you. Through the Chair, a number of questions have already been raised and answered, and I just obviously a couple of issues or a couple of questions maybe James might ask. Since we've just completed an options analysis in terms of our mass transit abilities on the Sunshine Coast here, how important does the Sunshine Coast International Airport play in that factor as a linkage for us to the new Ritchie City Centre?
Thank you, and through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. So the Sunshine Coast options analysis document includes a master plan for the provision of public transport across the Sunshine Coast in the decades ahead. One of the components of that master plan is the provision of what's called regional rail in the Camcos corridor, and that provides for a link from Maroochydore City Centre up to the airport. The timing for delivery of that is not yet certain, but that's a critical component of the public transport network. That it's envisaged at the appropriate point in time when passenger numbers make a provision of the service of that standard financially viable, then that connection directly from the airport into the city centre is a component of the overall transport master plan, public transport master plan for the Sunshine Coast.
Okay, thank you. The question was raised about the Northern Precinct, and just for what the use of that Councillor Winston raised. There's been, and I've also been receiving inquiries as well from organisations. Will there be height restrictions on the ability of what that northern precinct will be used? Because there's a lot of concern about the actual height of buildings already in place along Marcoola.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, of course, as I've already stated, the detailed planning has not yet been undertaken, but I'd imagine, being a planner myself, that there would be height restrictions. There are a number of requirements around the airport for OLS, for obstacle limitation surface, and other height restrictions which must apply to the airport. So I'd imagine they will all be taken into account, not imagine, they will be taken into account as part of any assessment for development on the airport site.
Okay, thank you. Can I speak to the officer's recommendation?
By all means, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Look, we've had a range of discussions around the table this morning and definitely concerns at how this project will be delivered. But as a new councillor, I wasn't around for a lot of issues leading up to this stage, and especially the expansion project. But this project has been delivered to drive our community and our region's economic growth. I'll just talk quickly to it. It specifically is in our corporate plan, in our REDS, is our Regional Economic Development Strategy. And we have an investment partner, or Palisades, that has experience overseas with Heathrow, Christchurch, Brisbane, Sydney and Darwin. And it's an opportunity now for us to support. I'll be supporting this officer's recommendation here this morning. It does align with obviously our agribusiness and our export ability as well. And Councillor Winston touched on the agri-food business, which in 2019 was valued around $700 million. So I'll be supporting it. I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to supporting this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Landsberg. Councillor Natoli.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. I've also got a number of questions, if you would allow me. Deborah, you spoke about the Maroochydore PDA and the master planning process. Can you just run me through how that process, like in terms of was the master plan put in place? Did it go out to community consultation?
Yes.
At what point was the number of units doubled in that PDA as a decision making of council? So just so I get some idea of that context of the master planning process and signing off on the PDA.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I'll revert to James on the master planning process. PDA, thank you.
Thank you, through Mr Deputy Mayor. Yes, the master plan for, or the development scheme for Maroochydore Priority Development Area was endorsed and adopted by the Minister, but in that instance the Minister had delegated the powers of the making of the plan and the consultation of the plan to Council. So Council undertook the preparation of the development scheme in its original form and undertook the public consultation and provided that report to Economic Development Queensland as part of its briefing to the Minister and his decision to adopt the development scheme. So the amendments that are undertaken, I believe the consultation process was undertaken in 2018, which increased redistributed a number of the activities, but enabled a larger proportion. And so there's from 2,000 to 4,000 dwelling units were allowed as part of that, were again subject to an engagement process undertaken by Council. And I might add that, inconsistent with the requirements of the Act on the Minister, Council produced a report in both instances of the submissions received and how they were responded to and what had been done to amend the content of the development scheme, so that the Minister was fully briefed in his decision to adopt the changes to the development scheme at that time. There hasn't been any changes to the scheme since then.
So do you envisage a similar process in terms of Council leading the planning process?
I believe in this instance that's a decision that we would, through you, sorry, Mr Deputy Mayor, that we would have to consider whether we would, Council would undertake the preparation of the scheme and undertake consultation, or whether Sunshine Coast Airport would undertake the preparation of the scheme and EDQ would undertake the community engagement process. I don't think that's been deliberately determined at this stage. It would be something that would be subject to consultation with Economic Development Queensland should the area be declared as a priority development area.
Can I, through you, Deputy Mayor, could I just add to that?
Yes, please.
We could request that occur. The Minister has sub-delegated that in terms of the submissions. So in terms of Council looking and undertaking the submissions report review, Council could request that as part of this as well, just like we do as part of the Maroochydore City Centre, but that has to be sub-delegated to us. So that's a decision of the Minister, but certainly Council could request that that occur. The same process as per the Maroochydore City Centre.
So I'm trying to understand it. I read in a report it says every major airport operates from a platform of a master plan that's been obviously approved, and the current master plan for the airport, 2040 master plan, is it not an approved master plan? And what part will it play in terms of the interim planning and the future scheme that the airport? I'm trying to understand the relevance of that document, whether it's fully translated into the interim scheme, or is it going to be a completely different scheme altogether?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. So just in terms of this master plan, 2040 master plan, as I've already stated, this is not a master plan, and it's unfortunate the name's master plan, because we always, certainly as planners anyway, we always think a master plan is a land use plan. That is not a land use plan. There was a requirement under the airport agreement, the framework agreement, to provide a master planning document, not a land use planning document, under the terms of that agreement within a certain period of time. The airport did that to satisfy the commercial agreement, not to satisfy or to in fact imply that that is a land use plan sitting in a land use planning context under the Planning Act. So that's a comment I can make. That has no. So if the airport came in today and said we've identified something in here and we'd like to lodge an application, we'd go back to our Sunshine Coast planning scheme and we would look at what column it fell into, and the decision would be made about whether it was impact or code or self-assessable. So that has no planning authority whatsoever. That has no planning consent whatsoever. It's not a planning document for planning purposes.
So I'm trying to understand, the public have been consulted on this.
Yes.
Correct. So I'm just trying to understand, Mr Deputy Mayor, is this going to form the basis of the future Sunshine Coast interim documents and final planning documents for the airport under the PDA? Or is it going to be a completely different type of document? I'm trying to understand
Is it the basis going forward?
Yeah. Through you, Deputy Mayor. It is my understanding in discussing this with the airport that will form a general would be a general guide to the precincts in terms of what they might do from a land use planning perspective. As I've already mentioned, and James has also mentioned it, this is not a land use planning document. So it's a very high level document. It's colours on a map, and it talks about uses that may or may not occur in those particular areas. It doesn't talk about GFA of those uses. It doesn't talk about heights of those uses. It doesn't talk about specific examples of those uses on particular blobs of land, if you like. It just says, here's our overarching intent for the airport in these kind of precincts. In terms of next steps, the airport, and I understand they've started doing some of this work already, the airport would have to provide detailed land use planning precincts in a precinct sense. So again, referring to Maroochydore, if you think about the high-level concept plan, but there is a document called the development scheme that sits underneath that. That is a very detailed document of each precinct, of the amount of GFA, the maximum amount of GFA and the maximum amount of residential density that can occur in each precinct. And it is that document that forms the approving development scheme. So it's just like a planning scheme, but it's a development scheme for Maroochydore. I'd imagine that will go down the same path as this, because there is no other way. If this went to Economic Development Queensland, so if Council supported the state and this went to Economic Development Queensland as a land use planning document for approval, Economic Development Queensland would not be approving this document in this form. There are no studies, there are no detailed studies, there are no traffic studies to the points that have been raised around traffic. There are no environmental studies that sit behind this. It is a high-level document, not a land use planning document that would go through the very detailed technical assessment that would need to occur in order for it to be a land use planning document.
So that's the point I want to get to, is actually understanding the pathway. To be able to have a master plan, obviously the document, the report here clearly says that you need to have all the substantiating technical documents.
That's correct.
So the question is, why can't that happen under our watch to the point where it's completed, to the point where it can be handed to economic development, so that the community's had a say and buy-in in terms of all of those impacts, understanding exactly what is going to be proposed there before we hand it over for a PDA to basically control what would be the process of making sure that, developments can get through the process quickly is what I can see the certainty that the airport wants.
I know the answer, but I'll hand across to my learned colleague here.
Thank you for the question, and through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. So a process of the kind that you're talking about, which would take the current master plan and propel it forward to a plan that would be much more easily able to be comprehended in terms of precisely what activities could occur where and under what circumstances, otherwise in what form, and what would be access arrangements, etc. Council could do that. However, Council would need to be very careful if its intention is for that plan to then proceed to Economic Development Queensland as the basis for the development scheme in a priority development area. Would have to be very careful to make clear to the community that they are commenting on something that is not a statutory instrument, because it wouldn't ever be for our purposes. It would be an iteration of the development scheme, taking it to the next phase. What makes that really important is that people then understand the context in which they're making their comments on that plan that we prepare. The comments they make would inform our consideration of how that plan, let's call it a master plan in the true sense of the word, might then be forwarded on to Economic Development Queensland. But we run the very real risk, and I've seen this happen before in other circumstances, where having commented on a document that it does not have statutory effect, when people are then given the opportunity to comment on that when it does have statutory effect, i.e. when Economic Development Queensland produces the development scheme and releases it for community consultation, at which time people's submissions actually count, people say, oh, I've already commented on that, I don't need to bother. Which is not an unreasonable thing for people to think. But of course, that's precisely when their comment does count. And so for us to do that, well, it's duplication for a start, and I think it runs a very real risk of confusing our community about what they're being asked to comment on and the statutory effect of the comments they make and when those comments actually count. It's something we could do, but it's something I would advise against, because I've seen it happen in a number of similar circumstances where councils have done consultation on a, say, local area planning strategy, which at that time had no effect. When the actual planning scheme amendment is released, people think they've already had a comment, so therefore don't bother, and they miss their opportunity to have a say when it most counts. So I would suggest not doing that because of the risk of confusing the community and actually undermining their rights to have a say when it matters.
Thank you. I'm just going to pause at that point, because we've now been going for nearly 2 hours, and I'm just cognizant of the amount of concentration involved in everybody's participation, and it might be time for a break. Do you have a question on that, or can we logically now break and resume with your further questions after the break?
To break and come back.
Lovely. So look, just in light of everybody needs a little bit of a reset, perhaps a nature break. 11:05. Resume it. Councillors, welcome back. Councillor Natoli, you're continuing to ask questions.
my mic. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I just want to continue to get a better understanding of the process. If we were to go down and support the officer recommendation, what the process will be then to put in place everything that the airport requires to have an approved master plan that will guide the land use planning for that. What is the time frames, the interim plan, what happens in that time in the interim plan versus, 12 months later when it becomes...
Might just go through you, Deputy Mayor, get James to talk to the process of what happens after declaration of the PDA.
Lovely, thank you.
Yes, through Deputy Mayor. So the master plan as prepared by the airport would have to be worked up into a document of greater detail. My understanding is the airport has been doing that for some time now. Since the time when they became aware of that either way, whether it is a plan incorporated into our planning scheme or a plan that is the basis for a development scheme needed that degree of detail and backed up by the types of studies that are necessary. So studies of hydraulic flooding, studies of vehicular access, and particularly in relation to the state road network. So that's been in play for some time. I'm not quite sure how well progressed that is, but I would imagine it's sufficiently well progressed for this matter to proceed with a request to Economic Development Queensland for their consideration for the declaration. That request for the consideration of declaration would have EDQ seek Council's view about a declaration, and depending on the decision today, that view would be a view of support or not, and it almost certainly wouldn't proceed if the decision was made not to do that. The process of the declaration of priority development area comes with two obligations on behalf of the Minister. One is to introduce an interim land use plan. So that is to make sure that there is effectively a safety net over the whole airport site. So once a PDA is declared, it effectively becomes a gap in our planning scheme. So you'll see when you look at the planning scheme now that over Caloundra South and Maroochydore, those areas are white in the scheme. They have no colours, therefore the scheme doesn't allocate uses or use rights. That's done under the development scheme. And that occurs at the time of declaration. So the Minister has to introduce an interim land use plan so that all matters can be dealt with satisfactorily while the development scheme is being prepared. The interim land use plan lasts for a year but no longer than 2. That aligns with the requirement under the Act. That's the second obligation that is placed on the Minister for the Minister to prepare a development scheme. So the interim land use plan in many instances is used to not just give you the safety net over the whole site, but should planning be sufficiently well progressed to enable the immediate consideration of a component of that site. In many instances I've seen the declaration of priority development area will have already indicated what specifically could occur in the first precinct that might proceed under the following declaration. And so that gives virtually immediate use rights for applications to then to be lodged under that advanced component of the interim land use plan. So the state government under the provisions of the Economic Development Act and the Minister is required to prepare a development scheme, as I mentioned before, in the process set down to conduct a process of community consultation, consider the submissions received, amend the scheme accordingly, publish the report about that, and then seek to have that development scheme gazetted. So that typically happens in around about a 12-month period, sometimes longer depending on the complexity, but most often in that time frame. So thereafter, the entire site would have a development scheme for it that reflects the long-term planning.
So just that interim 12 months. So basically our planning scheme doesn't affect. There's that interim safety net as you talk about. An application can be lodged. What rights does the community have, third-party appeal rights, in that 12 months during the interim? Do they have any?
No, there are no rights to lodge when an application is lodged under the Economic Development Act. There are no provisions for, there are no submitter rights in terms of taking the matters to appeal. Economic Development Queensland, as does Council, when a proposal is determined through a planning process to become subject to either what's called an accepted development, where no application is required, or a code accessible development, council would typically receive and have regard to submissions made, even though those submissions are not provided for in the Act and there's no process for having regard to them. It's quite common for Economic Development Queensland to be the recipient of submissions, which it clearly doesn't disregard, it looks at them, although those submissions there's no rights that result from those submissions being made, as there are no rights when a submission's made on a code accessible development itself. So I might just add that if council itself was to prepare a planning scheme provision for the airport, because of the significance of what is intended on that site, it would almost certainly be our intention to make most of the developments that would be essential for the airport's operations code accessible, so you'd have a similar regime in place.
So I'm just a little bit concerned about the fact that in that 12 month, the community don't actually have a say about the final planning regime.
They do.
Right at the beginning?
No, the interim land use plan is prepared without the benefit of any community consultation, and it operates in a similar way to, for instance, the temporary local planning instrument, where the council proposes that TLPI, as they're called, they don't require any consultation. They're put in place for a 12 to 24 month period and operate immediately without the benefit of any consultation.
I might take the opportunity to speak to the motion.
Thank you.
Thank you, James and Deborah, for answering those questions. Mr. Deputy Mayor, I obviously have a PDA in my division. As Deborah mentioned, some of the issues that have come up, I've found economic development have been very helpful in being able to resolve those and being forthcoming and being able to find a way through. The difficult matter is as a councillor, there is an expectation for the community that you are still their representative and you still have some obligation to try and find a pathway forward so that their voice is heard, even though technically you don't have a leg to stand on in terms of any decision making that happens within the PDA itself. And so the issue becomes, and what I've noticed is at times when the community have raised specific issues, our officers put their hands up and say it's not within our jurisdiction, it's a PDA. And having technical support for a local council to be able to help those residents is really important. It's important to know that when we're dealing with these PDAs, we just don't obligate our responsibilities. If it is a PDA and a councillor and the community are sort of saying that we have an issue, then we need to find a mechanism to be able to engage with the support of the technical support of the officers to try and put our case forward to Economic Development Queensland. And that, to me, I think, is an area that needs a lot of polishing. I think it can be achieved, but I think for me, it's a learning process in terms of how we deal with the PDA, especially on the periphery, on the edges. That's where the problems are occurring, not inside the PDA, but it's the conflicts sometimes on the outside of that. For me, listening to some of the concerns and reading and talking to residents in regards to the airport, the PDA, the community probably have been surprised by the timing and the time frame that they've had to respond to this. I think their concern is that they want to be heard. They have an interest, in particular, their interests around that airport and what the impacts are. I can understand that we, as a council, would like to give the airport certainty. It is a substantial investment the council's made, it's a substantial economic driver for the coast, and the interest of our community in general, doesn't matter where you come in the Sunshine Coast, has an interest because we do have a stake in that, both financially, ownership of the land, but in terms of making sure that that airport performs as it can. But on the other side, we have an obligation to the people that elect us And under the Local Government Act and the principles, it's very clear that we have obligations in terms of transparency, the way that we communicate, and the way that we engage with our community. And I think this process sort of grates against that very component of my representation and our representation for our community. I'd love to be able to find a process where we can give some certainty to the community before we actually lock it away. Because what we've been asked here is basically take away the appeal rights of our community. We're trading those away for certainty and the development of the airport. And I think this community needs to also be given the same certainty about what is going to be proposed. And we just heard that the interim arrangements that an application can be submitted to Economic Queensland, Development Queensland, that at this stage the community may not even have that visibility or have the ability to be able to appeal or have any issue with that. And I think that concerns me, that the community may not be given the opportunity to be able to have a proper say about the land uses that go into that airport. If we had that clarity, had a plan, and very clear plan, even though it may not be a statutory document, I would feel a lot more comfortable being able to submit that to Economic Development Queensland and say, create a PDA, basically a code accessible. Because a lot of the major developments I'm finding now in my division are, no matter how substantial they are, they're all code accessible. But the community's had a chance to have a say about that. They know in the planning scheme that this is what is being brought up. At this stage, we are going to lock away all those, lock away the community's right to object or to have a say and a third-party appeal rights on development that we still don't even know what is going to actually be proposed on this airport. And that to me, I think...
Would you like an extension?
Just a short extension of...
Somebody move. Extension. Councillor Suarez seconded. Councillor Winston, all in favour? That's unanimous. Please carry on.
So, for me, to defer in this matter and being able to take the time to be able to develop with the community what that framework would be maybe a 12-month process. If James is right that the airport's done a substantial amount of that work, that it's getting to the point where they feel confident that they can take it to Economic Development Queensland in a format that is ready for a PDA, then surely we could give the community the opportunity to be able to understand what that is, what that land use, before we trade away their third-party appeal rights. To me, I would feel much more comfortable if we had control of that as a council, in terms of that ability to be able to present this to the community and say, this is what's been proposed, we'd like to hear from you, and ultimately, at that point, make a decision whether we're ready and comfortable. The community's had their say, and we can then be confident that we could possibly hand it over to Economic Development Queensland and create a PDA in that area. It gives certainty both to the community, gives certainty to the airport.
Thank you, Councillor Natoli. Councillor Law. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you. Through you, Deputy Mayor. A couple of questions. I'll be as fast as I can. If we could just leave aside for a moment the notion of the conflict of interest, does the current planning scheme allow for all development that would be wanted on the airport by Palisades, by the airport authority?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, a number of the uses that you'd expect to see in an airport are impact accessible under the current planning scheme.
But that doesn't mean that they can't put the development applications in?
No, they can lodge. It doesn't preclude them from lodging a development application, but it opens it up to third-party submissions and appeal rights.
Okay. And since the airport was put under the 99-year lease and the runway was constructed, how many development applications have there been?
I don't know the answer to that question through you, Deputy Mayor, but I believe it's none.
So my question is, what is the need for a PDA under the terms of accelerated need for development?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, to give certainty for the investment of over $200 million that the airport intends to make over the following 5 years, and for them to be able to invest with that level of certainty.
Okay. And one of the other categories in the dot points of a PDA is community benefit.
Yes.
Well, how do we measure community benefit? What is that? Because all I read is economic benefit for the investors and the commercial operators who want to use the airport. And obviously an airport provides wider use of people coming and going, but how do we measure community benefit, please?
Thank you.
So, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. In appraising the benefits of an airport, it goes well beyond its role and its economic function. An airport, as we know, is a gateway to the Sunshine Coast from the globe, and it's a gateway to the globe from the Sunshine Coast. And so the role that the airport plays in Sunshine Coast's ability to be understood as a community, both by itself and by others, is seen as of critical importance. And so while that obviously has an economic dimension, and that's the dimension we tend to focus in on the most because it's the one that's measurable, the extent to which the airport represents that facility that provides a broader community benefit beyond its economic benefit that flows from that is one of the considerations that would be taken into account in the process of its declaration. So the Act says both for its economic benefit but also community benefit. So in putting forward a proposal to the Minister for his decision to declare that community benefit component would be addressed in the brief provided by EDQ to the Minister.
Okay, thank you. What would be the intended lifespan of the PDA, given that the lease is 99 years?
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, there'd be no defined time that the PDA would need to run for. It could be indefinite, but most likely it would have a time when it would have run its course. What we're seeing with Caloundra South, for instance, is that development is roughly about half of it has been approved under the Economic Development Act. There will be a time where there is no further benefit to that process proceeding, and a decision would be made to effectively, its declaration is expunged by the Minister and it returns under the planning scheme. That decision can really be made at almost any time, provided that all parties, being the Airport and Council and Economic Development Queensland, agrees. So there is no defined time. There would be presumably a time during which many of the major investment decisions would be made, and it would be obviously sensible for those decisions to be made under the regime that the PDA would establish.
And in your experience of the Stocklands PDA, how long has that been in existence?
That was declared in 2011, I believe, and so it's been in place for 10 years. I would envisage that it would remain in place for probably at least another 10. Okay. Just so you're aware that we don't do this routinely every year, but fairly often we approach Stockland and Economic Development Queensland for determine or their views about the desirability of that priority development area remaining in place. And so far the decision's been made that will continue to be the case for some considerable period of time. So I would have assumed that there will be a point in time where a sufficiently large proportion of Caloundra South has been effectively approved under the ED Act that the area could well transition across to, and just so we're under the Economic Development Act, there are very clear provisions for how the Minister seeks to effectively change a scheme across from a declared area to make it part of the planning scheme.
Okay. So you've mentioned that there is community consultation of 30 days which we could request to be extended. So we're looking at a possibility here that we have community consultation on an issue that will have an impact for probably 20 years, maybe more.
That's correct. The development scheme would put in place a planning regime over that period of time, bearing in mind that that can be subject to change and then subject to new consultation over time.
Okay. So commercially and for the economic benefit of the whole Sunshine Coast, this of course makes huge sense. Developing the airport makes sense. That community benefit for the local residents who live and work here every day, I'm still not satisfied with the community benefit answer, but maybe that's something that needs to be explored outside of this space. The lease is a freehold lease, and we're spoken that we have landowners' rights. What certainty can you give that we still have landowners' rights when we've given a freehold lease? To me, freehold is freehold, and you do as you will, as if you were the landowner.
Okay, through you, Deputy Mayor, we haven't given freehold lease. We've given a commercial lease over the land. Council still retains ownership of the land that the airport sits on. So I can give you all certainty that Council will continue to remain the landowner over the land that the airport sits on. It's a commercial lease for them to operate and do things on top of that land, effectively.
Where's the word and description of freehold come? Because I believe I've heard freehold lease.
I have not used that term, Deputy Mayor, through you.
Okay. So, as the landowner, how does the conflict of interest disappear when we are the landowner and the commercial beneficiary of the decisions that we make? It seems to me that the conflict of interest still exists as the landowner.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, the conflict of interest exists because we are the landowner and we also get a return on the outcome that occurs on that land. So we still get a commercial return. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 5% of gross revenue return. It's not a straight blanket. I would be less concerned if it was a straight $100,000 a year because it wouldn't matter what happened on the land. But we actually benefit from a better outcome, a more optimised outcome on the airport land by virtue of the fact that we get a return of 5% on gross revenue. So that conflict exists, which is why we're suggesting that in terms of so we wear four hats, as I've explained, and in terms of the other hats, the land use planning hats, the assessment authority hats, that we ask a separate authority to be the assessing authority for applications over the airport land, because we are the owner and our outcome is to get a 5% return on GR. That is part of the commercial arrangements.
Yeah, and I think I understood that from previous times. What I'm getting at is if the landowner can block any development application on the site, surely that puts us in a position of a conflict of interest. Even though we're not assessing the actual application that might be put in, as the landowner, we're basically vetoing any opportunity to develop on the land. So you haven't convinced me that we have we've removed ourselves from the conflict of interest.
Okay, through you, Deputy Mayor, I'll try and do my best. We own the land, we have to give landowner consent. In the event that something is an anomaly, doesn't look like it complies with the planning regime in existence, then we have the right to withhold landowner consent, because we would say it doesn't reflect what's been agreed in the development scheme, what our residents have had a chance to comment on. So take an example, say for instance the logistics area was moved and it was closer to residential areas, and the airport came in and said, we want to lodge this application with Economic Development Queensland. Don't worry, we've just moved the logistics over here and it's now abounding closer to residential properties, as an example. That would be a very real instance where council could say, actually, it doesn't comply with what our residents have seen, what our residents and ratepayers have seen in a land use planning context in terms of the development scheme, therefore we withhold owner's consent. They couldn't then progress with that application. The conflict arises because of the fact that we are, as I mentioned earlier, judge, jury and executioner. So we give landowner consent. If it sits in our planning scheme, we're then also the approving authority for an application over our own land. and that's where the issue comes from.
Okay. We recently adopted the CHAS.
Yes.
And when the runway was built, there was a significant uplifting of the land to build the runway. What will happen to the application of CHAS on the airport site if it's handed over to the state government to approve?
Take consideration.
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, the Economic Development Queensland would have regard for the CHAS. One of the reasons it would do so is the CHAS, the preparation of the Coastal Hazard Adaptation Strategy is a requirement of the state government. They've been funded by the state government.
Yes.
And so Economic Development Queensland, in seeking all the agency views about the considerations that need to be taken into account, bearing in mind that what is referred to as the state interests are clearly set down in the state planning policy, and they, even though Economic Development Act sits separate from the Planning Act, the state interests are considered in the state's dealing with any development and any planning proposal. So the state planning policy sets down the need for coastal hazard adaptation strategies and the need for coastal hazards to be thoroughly understood, and they would be taken account of in the preparation of the development scheme.
Okay. And while you're still there, would that apply to the impact of development using CHAS as the framework, that they have to consider it outside of the boundary of the airport?
Absolutely, through you, Mr. Mayor. All of the requirements of the CHAS dictate that what we call downstream effects or other effects, and that would be taken into account with the intention there be no net worsening of conditions outside of the site, so it has to be dealt with as part of that plan.
Okay, thank you. A final question, possibly for Deb, I'm not sure. Risks get mentioned quite often, at least 5 occasions. But at no point have I discovered any kind of assessment or measurement of the risk in terms of the severity or the frequency. It's just noted as there are risks of various things. There's a financial risk, there's an assessment risk, and so on, but no measurement of those risks.
So, in terms of I assume, through you, Deputy Mayor, my apologies. I assume, Councillor Law, that you're talking about the risk section contained within the report at page 17 of the report. The reports are standard template documents, so that's how we talk about all risks in all of our reports, whether that needs to be made stronger or reflected differently. I can certainly take that on notice, but there hasn't been a full assessment of the risks against our risk framework.
All right. Maybe that's something that needs some consideration in our other reports then. I guess this is the first time it's really been in the spotlight for me. I was looking for that measurement of risk and couldn't find it. So maybe through you, Deputy Mayor, there might be some consideration there going forward around how we talk about risk. I think I'm finished on my questions. If I might make a comment to the motion. Yes, it's about governance, and we've...
Comment or speaking?
Speaking.
Speaking, great.
I probably did say comment, I'm sorry. It's about the governance, it's about conflict of interest, it's about doing the right thing. We remain the owners, the custodians of the airport for our community, for the benefit of the community. And there's been a great deal of conversation that a PDA is the way to do that, because it will provide certainty and it will provide the opportunity for accelerated development and economic benefit. We've heard that the Maroochydore City Centre is a reasonably good example of how a PDA works. Jury seems to be a little bit out on whether it's working well for the benefit of the community in Caloundra South. But the certainty and the speed to development really intrigues me when I think of the PDA at Toondah Harbour in Redland. So that PDA was granted in around 2013 on a project of about $116 million of infrastructure and a master planned residential and leisure development of $1.4 billion. I'm not sure what the economic benefit for the whole region might be, but Toondan Harbour, the development hasn't begun. So 2013 to 2021, no development, and a lot of legal battles, a lot of conflict. We've heard that the state will look after our ecological and environmental benefits. Their track record at Toondan Harbour, which is a very sensitive wetland, a very important space, and also a Ramsar-listed wetland for migratory birds of significant international importance. And our state government are really trying to push this through, and we lose that habitat forever once it's built on. So I'm not convinced that a PDA will give the things that we really want for our airport area and that we want for the protection of our council, so that we make really, really good decisions, and we can support the development of the airport, support the $200 million investment, and make sure that the benefits from the regional economic development strategy actually occur. So my challenge is there must be a better way to do this, because I'm not convinced it's a PDA will achieve those outcomes that we've discussed today. I'm really keen to hear what Councillor Maria and Councillor Jason, as the two divisional councils most seriously impacted by what happens at the airport, both positive and negatively, because it will generate jobs. I accept all of the benefits. I'm just not sure this is the correct way to go about solving the conflict of interest, and in particular when it's going to take away the rights of our community. That troubles me greatly. So on that, I'm keen to hear what our local councillors most directly involved with the site have to say, and we'll go from there. But thank you very much, and I remain concerned.
Thank you, Councillor Law. Councillor Suarez, I assume you're speaking to the...
I am. Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Look, I see there's a lot of pressure points for main stakeholders here. Council with its conflict of interest in terms of the approval process, Sunshine Coast Airport with its ability to have a surety to significantly invest on the site, and the timeliness to do so. I'd like to thank Steve for the meeting that we had earlier this year to explain some of that, and perhaps to answer one of your questions, Councillor Law. By having a master plan, the Sunshine Coast Airport can apply for grant funding to assist with some of those infrastructure upgrades, which would then benefit another stakeholder, which is the industry on the site. So the industry, or the general aviation operators on the site at the moment, have no ability to grow and invest on the airport until a master plan is endorsed. The other stakeholder pressure point is with the community, their ability to have a say, and particularly when they are directly impacted. So it's a really tricky one to try and navigate. The Sunshine Coast Airport need to be able to progress, undoubtedly. However, they also need to allow the community and businesses at the airport to have a say, and I believe some of the alternative options would be a better way to do that. Sunshine Coast Airport showed good faith when they did engage with the community for the airport master plan by extending their community consultation period. And I've seen with other developers across the coast where they've engaged with the community and they've engaged with other stakeholders prior to putting in their development applications, they've been able to address a number of the concerns and issues that have been raised by those that are impacted. And what that has significantly resulted in afterwards is an easier approval process and less risk of third-party appeals. And that's what I'd like to see, an alternative way of assessing these applications and having involvement from general aviation operators as well as the community. I think there's a bit of misconception from the community, which is not my role to provide the answers to that. But one in particular was freight, and having freight aircraft, particularly just freight aircraft, moving about produce from the airport. It is typically in RPT aircraft, passenger aircraft, and that's how freight is transported around the community. So that, I just want to dispel that myth, and I'm sure the Sunshine Coast Airport could dispel a number of the others as well. I agree that we need to progress for the benefit of all four stakeholders, but I don't believe a PDA is the correct way, and I'd rather see an alternative.
Thank you, Councillor Suarez. Councillor O'Prey.
Question again, if I may, first.
Sure.
Mr. Chair. The question that Councillor Law brought up about the decision for landowners' consent is really, really critical in this decision for all councillors today. The landowner's consent is required before anything can come out of the ground, before the application can be approved. If something comes to council as an application and staff see it as out of the box, will that come to a full council meeting for a decision on whether we think that it is applicable for that location? Does that then give the council the full ability for veto of an application?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Just like to correct some of the language. An application, landowner consent is given for an application to be lodged. Without landowner consent, an application is not properly made. Sorry, you've said approved, but it's for lodgement. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is that we could work out internally what the process might be if there's something that comes to council that is not. So council will see the development scheme, the proposed development scheme through this PDA designation. That would come before council. If the airport lodged something that was completely directly in conflict with what council had seen, then as the officer in dealing with the airport, it would be remiss of me not to put it before council.
So for absolute clarity, we put our boundaries there in place first, which is decided by the council, which has been decided by the council, and future councils will make that decision as well. If something comes before the officers that is out of the box, it will come to full council for decision of the councillors, right? So therefore that ultimately gives councillors the veto ability. Is that correct?
So
yes or no?
Through you, Deputy Mayor. Internally, we would have to have a process. We haven't gone down this path yet, so that's why I'm being cautious. But internally, if it was decided and there was something added to the officer recommendation, that anything that came to council in terms of an application that was outside of what council had already approved in terms of a development scheme, then we could have an internal process that it comes before council. So the answer is yes.
Right. So thank you. And just to go on from that conversation, so ultimately the minister's the
deciding authority.
Yep, deciding authority, and then the landowner is the second priority. I don't know what the word is. This is the second.
So
what is the word? I'm sorry. I'm struggling from my vocabulary to get that the right way. So,
that's okay.
But the minister's got the decision making there.
Yep.
And that's only if landowner's consent's there.
That's correct.
So if that landowner's consent isn't given, that minister doesn't even come into the game.
No, because there's no application.
So what I'm trying to find out is where does the buck stop? So the buck stops with this council, doesn't it?
That's correct.
I'll speak to the motion now, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this has been very difficult for me. My community are wrapped around the airport, and this is ultimately about good governance. This is about good governance and good structure, and I believe that this council's got amazing structure wrapped around particularly the CBD, our instances where the PDAs have been in play, the questions have been answered, any conflicts or any decision-making processes have been very clean, very, very clean. I'd like to talk about the complete way of avoiding conflict of interest is by giving this to a PDA, to the state decisions to make that decision, which is ultimately controlled by us, as we just heard then. So it's ultimately controlled by the landowner. The ability for the community is really important to me as well, and it's important to every one of these councillors here today that they have their say. They have their say. It's concerning that they don't have their third-party appeal rights, as Joe's made mention to, but they still have the ability to make their message clear. And it's easy today. We get emails all the time, and if we've got them in the last 48 hours on this topic with short notice, it's easy for them to get the information to us that the community don't want something. So if that's the case, we've got an easy ability to veto it, as Deborah has just said. Right? So the ability for the community to have a say is still incredibly strong. It's incredibly strong. And I believe it's strong enough for this council to go ahead with the PDA on this. The ultimate decision for me today was the fact that we can still veto any decision that comes through, any application that comes through. I think that's really critical, councillors, that we understand that. Just like any other planning scheme amendment or application or MCU that comes through here, we can call it up to council at any time and we can make a decision as a political body. Right? So I'm fairly confident going into a PDA for this will keep us away from the conflict of interest. It does create good governance, there's no question about it. It does still give us complete control at the end of the day, and the ability, and the community still has an ability to have a say. So all that said, and all in the big mix, as a divisional councillor, I'm going to support this today. It won't be easy for some of the people, but I've got to say that I think this is the right way to go for this council for the next 100 years, and a priority development area is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Prey. Any other speakers? In that case, I may choose to speak to the motion. Councillors, I thought that the questions today were incredibly insightful and rigorous, so thank you for all that. Having said that, I thought one of the key concepts here was in the beginning of PDA, priority. I think this community has recognised that the airport development is one of our key region-making projects, and we have seriously invested in its development, its support, in the partnerships, because we recognise that it is an economic engine for this region. I also tend to think that in terms of community benefits, the ability to have a gateway, both nationally and internationally, can't be underestimated culturally. So I actually think that's a major benefit for this community. And I do think that a PDA is designed, the very purpose of it is to simplify the process, to facilitate something like $100 to $200 million investment. And it gives me great comfort that, to some extent, there are 15 other airports, many of them regional, that operate under a similar planning regime, given the differences in states. So, councillors, I'm going to put my faith in the community's wish to continue on this journey that we started many years ago to develop an airport that was suitably configured and has a planning regime that will allow it to develop the facilities and the operational side of it to deliver the benefits to this region. And I think the PDA is that mechanism. So I'll be supporting the officer recommendation today. Are there any other further speakers? In that case, I shall put it to the vote. Those in favour. Sorry, my apologies, Ted. It's been a long time. Would you like to close, Ted?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to start by congratulating all councillors today. What I like about this council is each person looks at it from their own angle, the questioning, the rigour on this. I haven't seen this in the council before, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. No voting blocks, no closed minds, no going with predetermined things. Every person takes it all into account. And I think that's a real amazing stamp for this council, and I hope it continues. Okay, this is about governance and good governance. This council has a proven track record on good governance. That's why we get unmodified audits in all areas all the time. This one here is a tricky one, and I do understand the community's concerns, and I'm like that. I would never turn my back on the community. I'd also like to congratulate the CEO on bringing this out of Wednesday's ordinary meeting, considering the large agenda we have, and look at the time we spend on this one. It would be a very long day, go well into the night, I think, to get through that agenda. So for those that say that it was rushed and this was brought in especially to cut it off, like I've had that in the emails and everything, incorrect. It was on the ordinary meeting agenda anyway. Because it's a large item, it would take time. It's been brought into here, and I think that was a very wise move, so this sort of scrutiny can take place. Now, I've heard here today, and the statement that this locks the community out of it. The community will not have a say. They will not have input into the scheme. Incorrect. If this is made a PDA, we will continue to maintain our role as landholder of the site. and would be an advice agency in the context of both the preparation and consideration of a development scheme. Totally. Which would be considered before the scheme is finalised. This includes full community input for up to 30 days. And even after the scheme is put in place, any incompatible application with the scheme as landowner, we would not give consent to. That gives us a very strong case to back our community up. And the statutory requirements for the scheme to be public notified, and the community has opportunity to make submissions on the draft scheme, which must be considered before the scheme is finalised. We're there to advocate for our community the whole way. And that has a minimum of 30 business days for the proposed development scheme for community consultation. And we're the advocates for that community consultation and that being taken into account. So at no point are we turning our back on the community. And I would not do that. I'm sure every councillor here feels the same. We will be the strong advocates all the way through this, and the oversight, when the planning scheme is in place, on each of those development applications, that they're in line with the scheme that's been agreed to by us, with the community consultation, and we can veto those by not giving consent. That gives us a very strong role, and very strong role for our community. I do not believe that the fears that this is going to lock the community out aren't really real. I had similar concerns when we went into the city centre and doing a PDA there. I had concern that we were giving away control. But that's been proven to me. Now we're going through that one there that has worked very well. And we do have control. Any changes to that has to come to us. That gives us strong control to keep what we put out to the community in the first place is kept in place. So I ask you, councillors, this is the right way to go. It is good governance and gives us a clear path into the future. Please support this motion.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hungerford, and apologies again for jumping into the vote. So having closed, councillors, I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour of the officer recommendation. Councillor Landsberg, Councillor Cox, Councillor Winston, Councillor Hungerford, Councillor O'Prey, Councillor Babarowski. Those against? Councillor Natoli, Councillor Dixon, Councillor Suarez, Councillor Law. The motion is passed. Thank you very much to our officers and to our guests. Thank you very much for being here. And we might now move on to the next item. Okay, so we just pause a moment while the gallery exchanges. Councillors, item 4.2, Sunshine Coast Council Workplaces Program is the next item. I can see Brendan's at the rostrum, so Brendan's going to present the presentation, or Francis?
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. So I'll introduce the presentation for this afternoon, noting that we have Francis Cayley and Isaac Pitkinsgill, who will speak to the details of part of the report for today, and also acknowledge in the gallery Gary McLean, who's with us from the McLean Yayo Group. So thank you very much. Through you, Deputy Mayor. The report that we have today is covering two elements. The purpose of the report is to speak to the Sunshine Coast Council Workplaces Program and to seek council approval to amend the Sunshine Coast City Hall budget. And that's the content of the report that's here for you today. In relation to the Sunshine Coast Workplaces Program, that's a descriptor of our overall approach here at Council for planning and managing all of Council's workplace locations across the region. So they cover the three administration key centres of Caloundra, Maroochydore and Nambour. It's alongside our council depots and satellite service locations, which includes facilities such as libraries, showgrounds and venues. Now, a key element of our workplaces program is ensuring that council, our services, our people and our assets are best placed in the shared interests of our community and region and particular in there is around delivering projects that build confidence, that assist in generating jobs and encourage investment, the benefits of which apply across the region. Organisationally, the benefits is using our land and building assets to provide better long-term benefits, repurposing some of our underutilised spaces and reducing operating and renewal costs. In part, that's through consolidating our current leased costs. And in doing so, we improve the quality and value of the community portfolio property. And for our people, in terms of bringing our workplaces and workspaces up to a modern standard that supports their continued focus on delivery of services to the community. In particular, when we're looking across our workplaces elements, we're looking at each of council's owned buildings and the consolidation of core administration buildings at Maroochydore, Caloundra and Nambour. For Maroochydore, with a focus on it being the principal regional centre in our growing Sunshine Coast region. For Caloundra, looking to the future of a community and creative hub that's comprising the event centre, district library, new expanded town square and regional art gallery. And for Nambour, redefining its future as such an important centre with a significantly upgraded precinct, potentially including a new modern library, community meeting spaces and heritage and arts hub and music opportunities throughout that area. So the report provides an update on the particular initiatives across those centres and also with reference to our depots and satellite and service locations. From that context then I'll hand over I think to Isaac, who will speak then particularly through to the budget and financial arrangements.
Thanks Brendan, good morning all. So Council, on page 30 of the special meeting report is two tables which highlight the current workplaces program, which is our 3 buildings included here, just on the screen now, which is at the City Hall at $80 million, the Clown Return to Activation, which is building right now, the library at 28.7, and the Nambour Administration Precinct at $13.5 million. So the report makes mention to the increase required for the completion of City Hall, and the way in which that is funded will be a shifting of the budget for the projects out to the following financial years. The reason for this is it moves the cash impact of the City Hall over a longer period of time rather than just in one financial year. It's important to note that we do not require any adjustment to the budget for this current financial year. It's only in the outer years in which it's required. So, in terms of how that's funded, the City Hall itself and the whole workplaces program is funded through $80 million of debt, the remainder of council's cash. This increase to City Hall, it will be used as cash will be used, and there will be no adjustments made to the current capital works program, in which we have already adopted recently, and no increase to rates in order to fund this. It will be use of council's cash. So in terms of the actual requirement for the City Hall building, I might hand over to Francis to talk through the components of the building itself.
Thanks, Isaac. Councillors, there's a lot of content within the report that breaks down each of the core components of the proposed budget revision. This slide is about bringing that up to a level so that we can summarise exactly how we're demonstrating each of the figures. Most importantly, that to deliver the building, inclusive of the fit out, the fees associated with consultants and authority fees and charges, and the furniture, fixtures and equipment is $87.5 million. There's $4.7 million in the financial tables Isaac just showed you that relates to the new scope being levels 8 and 9. And whilst we've got a funding decision as part of today's discussion that was about demonstrating completeness for the project, noting that the officer recommendation sees a December ordinary meeting report to talk in detail about levels 8 and 9. And then $7.8 million in contingency, which recognises the current market and the volatility that exists in construction across the industry and particularly in South East Queensland and the Sunshine Coast. I've
probably skipped myself forward, but that is the detail that I'd just gone through. So ultimately, when we looked through, when we did a project review and looked at what the market was sending in terms of costs associated with the core pieces of this project, it is evident, and certainly not just exclusive to this project, that there are escalation in construction costs across the industry. I mentioned the additional scope, so that was never included in original budgets. And of course, we've increased the project contingency to recognise this market. Back to you, Isaac.
Thank you. So this table more just highlights the history of the City Hall project, which we started back in 2018, and made our way up until now, until February. So February 2021, then the report we have in front of you today. So I guess it's really important to note that the original contract that was signed, which is the $59.5 million, which is the base build contract, is currently still on track, and the changes required additional contracts or additional levels that were not included in the original scope. So as Francis just said, level 8 and 9, there's a council report coming next month, which there will be a decision made by the council as to whether to take up that requirement. And the officer recommendation.
Thank you. Rather brief. Okay, councillors, do have somebody to move the officer recommendation? Thank you very much, Councillor Hungerford. A seconded, Councillor Cox. You have a moment to compose yourself, Councillor Hungerford, but would you like to open?
In meetings, I'm quite often moving and talking to everything. This one here is fairly straightforward. What we have across the building industry, and I think we've all seen it, I've seen articles where a lot of builders are struggling to get materials and their costs are going up and they've got fixed contracts, and some of those are struggling financially, and unfortunately this is right across the whole industry. What we're looking at here is we have those increases. We also have what we're going to do with floors 8 and 9, whether we utilise those ourselves. And remember, we're going to over 500,000 people by 2041. So our office space is going to be needed. Do we keep those what we don't need at the moment? Do we purpose it for going out to some other use? They're questions we've got to come to over time. And we're taking our time with this. What we're doing importantly here is, rather than just borrowing more money, which is not the way I do anything, we're looking at our current cash, our current capital works program, and we're factoring it in so we can keep it sustainable. That means it doesn't increase the rates in next year's budget just for this one item. So we're working very financially prudent for our residents to use the cash balance we have there at the moment rather than a long-term debt provision. But then we've got to look at our capital works and be able to sequence them so we can be sustainable into the future. Because I believe this bubble we have at the moment, the shortage of supplies, costs increases, the work shortage of having skilled labour to do that, that's also a thing contributing, will be a short-term thing. I believe in about 12, 18 months' time that will start to reverse. And by taking the prudent way of doing this at the moment and handling it within our own current capital works program and our cash balances, will put us in a very strong position when we come out of that side of it. Some I've seen in the media trying to make out this is mismanagement and a blowout. Well, yes, it is an increase. The whole industry is in the same boat, not just us. But what defines us is how we handle it and how we restructure ourselves to absorb that in the interest of our ratepayers. And I believe that's what we're doing very sensibly here. So put it to you, councillors, this is a very sound way forward.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Councillor Natoli.
Just a question in regards to the consultant. It's single, not plural. So is there only one consultant where the costs have gone up on the base build?
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Councillor Natoli, looking at the tables
from top of page 30 where it says consultant, the second line, it says consultant
yeah,
costs,
okay.
not consultants.
It should have been plural. There are multiple consultants representing council on this project.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. Can I just speak to this, Mr.
Sorry?
Can I speak to?
Yes, by all means.
Obviously, we're all very much aware of the pressure on construction costs, and there's no doubt when you go into these large building projects, when you're faced with increased costs, it's going to be large. And $20 million by no means is something to sneeze at. I look at the missed opportunities. As much as we're not borrowing more money, it's still an amount of money that has to be found from somewhere. It comes from cash. The way that we've done this is by sliding some of the projects in Caloundra and Nambour into forward years, and with that we haven't actually attributed any possible increase in costs associated with those. So we may be faced with much more increased costs when we get to the end of the process, when we start to build Nambour and start to build on Caloundra. It is part of the issues, I suppose, that we as a growing region are confronted. There has been, for many years, a program of regional making projects, and obviously we've seen the economic benefits of some of those, and we've seen the economy here on the Sunshine Coast doing well. But as an elected member, you look at the very basic things within your community and sort of think, well, at some point you've got to somehow bring an end to this and go back to the basics and just gather yourself and have a chance to actually breathe, and before you move into the next iteration of growing the region. And I can see the forecast ahead. You know, we've got the stadium contribution that we've got to find money in. We've got the Olympics coming ahead, and I'm trying to think, where are we going to get this break? Where are we going to get this breather, which allows us as an organisation, because I'm struggling to build pedestrian crossings, I'm struggling to put footpaths in, I'm struggling to get lighting budgets, I'm struggling in a whole range of areas that, you know, our bread and butter is when our communities are knocking on our doors and saying, we need this. I'm struggling to give young, fledgling community organisations a little bit of seed money to be able to put cultural events for free on the community. And when you think of $20 million, what you could build in social housing if you had to do it, or $20 million in footpaths or rural roads or whatever it is, it's part of, I suppose, this issue for us. Now, I understand that, you know, we need to finish this building, and I will support this motion because it's important for us to understand that, you know, when you jump, you have to take the full consequences. And we've committed to this project, and we have to commit to finish this project. It's not something, but I think, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for us as a council, we do have to come together and discuss how we can manage the budgets with the impacts of these region-making projects, because I think, Madam CEO, you know, that's a real challenge for us. And I think, especially with the current environment that we have at the moment, we're not getting a lot of money in return, even though we're getting state government and federal government stimulus funding. That's eroded by the cost of increases for some of these projects, so we're not getting as big a bang of buck for that money that we're getting from other levels of government. So at the same time, it puts enormous pressure on our bottom line and our budgets, and that's a concern that I have. And it's just unfortunate we've been caught out.
Thank you, Councillor Natoli. Councillor Cox.
Chair, and through you, I'll be supporting this here today, and I just wanted to quickly outline a couple of the reasons why. First of all, though, I just wanted to touch on some of the commentary I've heard in relation to this being the Taj Mahal, and we're sort of, you know, building all of these luxuries into it. And I just want to dispel some of those mistruths that I've been hearing, all those myths, because I look around my 9 years in council, especially in this building, and I see a lot of the furniture that was brand new back in 1995 when this building opened. So, you know, it's not that we're elaborate with our spending. I think we're very financially responsible for the ratepayers of the Sunshine Coast. It's unfortunate that a lot of our chairs held together with tape, but we do need to provide furnishings for this new facility. So I just wanted to put that out there because there's been some commentary around that which I find really frustrating. But look, I just wanted to bring back to everyone's attention to the report, and it was something that actually Mr McLean sort of raised last week when he was doing his presentation to Council about just the market volatility that's around at the moment, especially in the construction industry, and just how that's impacting not only this council project, but it's happening to our residents. I know of a number of residents that are in the process of renovating or building new houses, and certainly the cost has raised significantly in the last 12 months. 10-15% is not uncommon, can be even higher. So we're not immune to that. This is happening to us as well. But one thing I did want to point out is that this is an asset that's actually appreciating in value at the moment. So yes, we are paying more money, but it's actually going up. It's sitting on our balance sheet as an asset that will be appreciating in value. So there is that to consider as well. I just wanted to, I started to touch on something Ms McLean raised, and he gave an example of a project that was valued, I think he said 70 million in June, and right now, as of last week, you said that had gone up to $82 million. So that's an escalation of around $12 million just in a matter of months. So this is happening everywhere. South East Queensland, it's really probably impacting the most. And I also just wanted to finally touch on the fact that I have read some comments about this additional cost potentially affecting some of the projects here in Caloundra with the Centre Activation Project and also up at Nambour. And I just wanted to let my community, Division 3, know that I won't let that happen. Yes, it will be a slight delay, but I will be fighting to make sure Caloundra, southern end of the Sunshine Coast, keeps its fair share. That was always, my support was always given on the fact that for City Hall, that Caloundra was next in line. The investment needs to come here, especially this building, turn it into the library and community facility. And I know, to anyone listening out there, that there's Divisions 1, 2 and 3 will fight hard for the people of Sunshine Coast on the southern end of the region, because our time is coming, and that's why I'll be supporting this here today.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cox. Councillor Suarez.
Thank you, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Some great comments by Councillor Cox. Yeah, a lot of the reasons for the costing escalations are real, not only experienced by people who are building and renovating, but obviously the people who are in the building industry trying to deliver those projects. It is not great news, obviously, when you're the sitting councillor for an area and you have to go and tell your residents that we don't have any money for things like horse trails, and then we have to present this saying we've got $20 million, you know, for the city centre. So we're kind of damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. I just have a question though about understanding the finances of this. So we're shuffling our capital works projects out for Caloundra and Nambour. We're deferring them so we can accommodate this cost in this this impending cost, but eventually that's going to have to impact somewhere down the line. So we're not increasing our debt, but it will affect our cash reserves. So does that then mean that we just won't be able to build up our cash reserves as we would have liked to prior to this report coming to council?
Yeah, through the chair, that's correct. So our strategy was to build up our cash reserves, our unrestricted cash reserves, over a 3 to 4 year period. That would just take longer.
So what are we sort of looking at in terms of extension from 3 to 4 year period to what are we looking at now?
Sure. So through the chair, the minimum amount we were looking for was $90 million for unrestricted cash, which is a 3-month ratio that QTC sets. We were going to be over 3 months at the end of next financial year. We'll still be that with this project. We were aiming to get up to 4.5 months by 2024-25. So you're probably looking another 2 years to reach that goal. So.
To reach the 4.5.
Correct. Yeah.
And I just want to get final clarity and assurance that no other capital projects that are in our forecasted capital project for 10 years out will be affected by this decision. Is that correct?
Through the Chair, that's correct. So the intention is to keep the Capital Works program at its current level.
Okay, thank you.
And can I take it that we're speaking to it?
There's questions, but I don't I'll reserve.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Johnston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. There is no secret around this building or this council that I'm really annoyed about the $20 million over costing of this building. But I'm also a realist, and I realise that, for us to achieve what we wanted, what had previously been decided by the previous council within the budget that was set at that stage, with the current environment, cost increases, etc., that was really unachievable. What I would also like to say is that, the increase in the contingency from 5 million to 7.8 million, well, that may not be spent. So, that's a cost that has been factored in, and it's prudent to do so. The 4.7 million fit out for levels 8 and 9, the previous council decided to build a building, and they were going to occupy the first 7 floors and fit them out, etc. And basically, it's up to us as a council in the future months to decide what's going to happen with level 8 or 9, whether we're going to lease it out to other bodies or whether we're going to keep it for ourselves for future growth or whatever other purpose. And whilst it was not originally estimated to spend that money as part of this construction, when one looks at it, you've got a 7-storey building fully fitted out, and then 2 years later or 3 years later, you go and fit out the next 2 floors. Now, we're talking about fit out, we're not talking about furniture, we're just talking about fit out. So imagine the damage that will be done to the existing building or the building during the moving in and out of all of that fit out 2 or 3 years down the track. And the cost, the additional cost that would be expended in doing so. So I can understand why the 4.7 million has been allocated. The furniture, fittings and fixtures and equipment for the building initially wasn't budgeted in, and it's possible that instead of taking it out of rate money, it could be, I say could, and that's a decision that council has to make, it could be leased when we make that decision. And that wasn't included before. So, although I'm very disappointed at the increase, I understand why it has occurred. I've interrogated council officers in a nice way. And, they've provided all of the answers. I don't agree 100% with everything that they say. Like, for instance, there's the observation that, well, it's not going to cost us anything. We don't have to defer anything. We're still going to be doing all the projects, etc., etc. But what it really boils down to is this. It's an extra, if all of these costs come to fruition, it's an extra $20 million that we're going to have to take from the ratepayers. It may, instead of being taken off over 3 years, it's going to be taken over 5 or 6 years, right? And that means that ultimately, somehow or other, we either have to increase rates to replace those cash reserves, or we have to forego some programs of construction infrastructure. And, you know, it's basically a bit of smoke and mirrors in my opinion. But the fact of the matter is we are taking an extra $20 million from our ratepayers. And I'm mindful of one other thing.
Can I just get you to pause for a second? Would you like an extension?
Yes, sure.
Moved Councillor Hungerford, seconded Councillor Dixon. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Please carry on.
Thank you, councillors. The other thing I'm mindful of is that we have men and women who work in our depots throughout this local authority, and some of the conditions that they have to endure and work from are fairly primitive. Like for instance, in one of the depots, the amenities for the men and the women are fairly basic, and there's a wall between the men's and the women's which is paper thin virtually, and I don't think that's acceptable because I know what men in say in their toilets from time to time, and I don't think that that's fair enough that women have to deal with that. But apart from that, there are other facilities. For instance, it took us 4 years to provide at Beerwah depot connectivity for phones and internet and all that sort of stuff. 4 years it took, you know. That's not acceptable. I came on the council and I wanted to know who was the genius that made that decision, all right? That decided to put a depot out there with no connectivity. And the fellows, the foreman and that had to come into Caloundra to use the internet, you know. So let's get some reality in relation to some of these things. Let's start treating our outdoor workforce at a level which is comparable. They don't need all the fancy stuff that we have in our main offices, but let's treat them in a decent way and make sure that they get decent facilities. It might surprise a few, but I'll be voting in favour of this.
Thank you, Councillor Winston. Councillor Law.
Thank you, through you, Deputy Mayor. I have a couple of questions, if I might. In regard to the future capital programme, I'm concerned because it's our intention not to change that. So my question is, what sort of certainty, and I'm not sure who can answer this, but what certainty is there of our intentions for our capital programme, and what certainty is there for the Nambour precinct? So we've rescheduled and moved things around to achieve this outcome. Where will we be when the staff have moved and we're in 2023-24 looking at the budget? What certainty that Peter has spoken well for Caloundra, so what certainty Nambour to remain in the future budgets?
Thank you, Christian. Do you want to give that a shot, Isaac?
Yeah, through the Chair. So the certainty remains with the council. So every budget is adopted by the 11 councillors. So essentially it's a decision by all of you every year to include those projects in the program.
Sorry.
CEO.
Thanks, Isaac, and through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. We remain very committed to all of our work that we're doing across all of our workforces. Councillor Johnston brought up the commentary around our field staff, and we're equally committed to understanding that. We've done an urgent review across all of our remaining workplaces to understand the quality and any difficulties or challenges we might be having with amenity at those places. With respect to Nambour, we are still at the early phases of design for that, so it is too early for us to say what we think will be managed there, but we have a number of very strong focus areas that will remain in Nambour, not least of which is our disaster response management, which is a very important part of us for Council. In terms of the forward capital project, Isaac has outlined that process and all of you will be part of that decision making. What you will probably hear though is that the impact of cost escalation across all of our capital projects is real and is happening to us today. We are having steel shortages, timber shortages, concrete shortages across our full range of capital works projects, and that is having a material impact on our delivery of those items. So I don't want anyone leaving today saying nothing was raised about this and it's not an impact. It's not the subject of our conversation today, but it is certainly front of mind for us in defining what council can bear in terms of a capital works project and when we are best phasing our capital works so that we can deliver them in a way that is most effective and best use of our capital for our community.
Thank you, CEO. Councillor Law.
Thank you. Good answers. I guess I will remain forever concerned because of how, as Isaac, as you say, it's up to the council and the budget process each year as what's in and what's out. So that remains and leaves me with some concern. We've had a lot of conversations and there's no disagreement around the cost of construction, but can I just confirm the actual cost of the contract that was agreed, the 59 million, that is going to be delivered at that amount because it was a fixed contract, is that correct?
That's correct.
So the additions and the increase is all result of other things outside of that contract?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
If I may, through you, Deputy Mayor. That is not exactly true. We do have a fixed price contract, but some of the changes that have occurred through this process will be enacted as a variation to that contract. So we will see a variation for the base contract that will have a variation associated with it. And then we are currently in the stages of negotiating for our fit-out contract, which is a separate contract to the project.
Thank you. So I think from the table that was on page 9 of the slides, we've got the base build contract staying and remaining the same at 59.5, and we can see how the fit-out amounts went down and have now gone up. That's where the impact of the heated construction sector and supplies, etc., is coming in through there. I've understood that correctly, yeah?
Yeah, through you, Mr Deputy Mayor, that's correct, Councillor Law. It includes what the CEO just referenced as changes to that base building brought about by the fit-out change and the escalations in the market.
Thank you. So my next question then, we're told that the report for level 8 and 9 will come back to us in December, but we're being asked to agree the budget today. I think I would prefer to see the budget allocation of the 4.7 for level 8 and 9 to coincide and come with the options report, because otherwise we might have to revisit this and say, well, actually, if you want this option, that might be only 2 million, or if you want that option, it could be 10. I'm wondering that level 8 and 9, we need to remove that just at the moment.
Through you, Mr Deputy Mayor. Councillor, the inclusion was for transparency of completion, so as not to omit a cost that we would later bring under separate report. The reality is those costs have been tested to some extent using the figures of our recent fit-out tender process. So we'd anticipated providing, in effect, a like-for-like fit-out of what was on the floor beneath, for example, and anything less that council does in those spaces, including open meeting rooms or open community kind of civic function spaces, if that were any of the considerations. It's a lesser cost, but we're giving it as the band that we would expect up to 4.7 million to fit out in full for commercial use.
Thank you. Maybe some advice from the CEO, if I might, Deputy Mayor, is that the right way to do it, to have the 4.7 now without knowing what the use is? Is that how you would prefer we go ahead here? Because I'm thinking if you've got a number, it restricts thinking, but it also allows thinking up to that amount. And as a subsequent question, which you may be able to answer at the same time, how would it be if we were asked to have, I think it was on item B, that we had the word maximum put in, that is it a maximum increase of 20 million, rather than just an increase?
you want to try answering that, CEO?
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor. You're right, Councillor, there are a few different ways of handling that cost. I think what's front of mind for me at this point in time is we are currently negotiating a fit-out contract and understanding some of the fit-out of level 8 and 9 for things such as bathrooms, which you're going to want a similar sort of fit out along the way, may actually give us some ability to manage those costs rather than having them negotiated and allocated on further down the track. So I think it gives us scope to commence and in good faith and work through those fit out conversations while still bringing back what the full purpose of those floors may be. And there are multiple options for those floors that the team have started to work up for that meeting in December. So I guess ultimately, if the decision is to hold that, the only impact will be that we may not be able to, it may be another variation for some of the fit-out constraints today as we're doing that fit-out negotiation.
So it's actually more cost effective to do it this way, even with that uncertainty, is what I'm hearing. How are you with the word maximum on item B?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I am absolutely fine with that word maximum. I'm not sure what life would look like if I had to come back in here and talk to you again, but it would be with a very serious and measured reason that we would have that conversation. So our intent is for this to be a maximum. We have put in a contingency into this project that is considered to be fair and reasonable for a project of this size with the amount of scope that we have left to do. So I imagine that that's the case. However, with the current volatility of the market, I can't tell you hand on heart that this is going to be everything maximum forever. I'm just happy with that version at the moment to say maximum, and we can continue that governance.
Thank you. Through you, Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure if this would therefore be an amendment or a small edit, and maybe ask the Councillor Ted, who moved the motion and is also takes a significant lead in our budget and finances, if he would consider inserting the word maximum in item B.
Councillor Ted, are you willing to accept a small
I'm willing
edit?
to accept that because that's the intent at this point in time. We're not looking for an increase unless we have further vote, as the CEO said, and of course it can come back to us at a further time, but I'm quite happy to add that in there.
And the seconder? Yep, happy with that. Thank you, Councillor Orr.
Thank you for that. I might talk to the motion, speak to the motion. Look, it makes no sense not to do and not to finish the project. I can't see any logic in that whatsoever in any way that you look at it. My concerns remain around the future and what happens elsewhere outside of this project. As Councillor Peter mentioned, talking very strongly in support of Division 1, 2 and 3 and ensuring that everything in Caloundra goes ahead as per scheduled. I guess really I'm saying that we will need, and I would like for that same level of support to be coming across what occurs in Nambour, what occurs in the hinterland, but also what occurs across the whole capital budget as we try and get back to a shift, or not get back to what I see as a shift from region-making projects to taking a focus on being able to really try and catch up on some of the capital work that hasn't been happening, that I have become very aware of the need across the whole community of things that are not happening and not taking place because we're so very much involved in the region-making project. So I have high levels of concern over this, but I can't find the sense in not supporting it because we've got to finish the project. You know, it then leaves us with a whole range of options of what do we do with a finished building that is an appreciating asset. So I guess to balance my concerns around the future developments across the whole Sunshine Coast, I've got some certainty that we have an amazing asset that we could be able to use in other ways should we need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Law. If there are no more speakers, Councillor Ted, would you like to close?
Through you, Mr. Chair. I was happy to include the word maximum in there. My reason being, the City Hall project is from 80 million to 95.3, with the 4.7 put in there for floors 8 and 9. That is prudent to put that in at this stage to finalise what we're doing rather than come back at a later date. I'd like to point out that we've increased the provision in the project contingency from $3 million to $7.8 million. That's an increase of $4.8 million. Noting that the existing $3 million contingency has yet to be drawn on, so we haven't used that at all. So that's why I was happy to include that, because we have got a $7.8 million contingency there now to give us a buffer. So I feel confident that this won't come back again unless the market deteriorates considerably. So what that does is it gives us the ability to do that, because that means the actual increase goes from 80 million to 92.2, which is a real increase of 12.2 with the market reality we have at the moment, and hopefully that 7.8 million will not be required. So that's why I was happy to accept that. We don't, as councillors, we don't enjoy having to deal with this, the blowout in the market and the blowout in any project cost, but this is happening, as the CEO said, on most of our projects. I had a small footbridge in my division. We've allocated $40,000 to it. It's a small footbridge and a footpath I'm doing. The cheapest tender came in at $135,000. That's the sort of thing we're dealing with. And I'll put that on hold because I didn't see it as good value. Try and get a better value at a later date. But they're the sort of things we're having to deal with, and that's why we're having to deal with this and shuffle our capital works program. But we're not saying we're not doing those things. We're just being responsible within our current finance parameters. I'll put this to you. This is very prudent.
Thank you, Councillor Hungerford. Councillors, put the officer recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? And that is unanimous. Motion is passed. Thank you very much, councillors. That concludes the second item, and therefore our workshop is at 12:30. Yep, sorry, just conclude the meeting formally. So that finishes the special meeting.